Hey there, welcome to Outlaw Icons, where history whispers in the dark. Tonight, we're stepping into the story of Frank Matthews. Some called him Black Caesar. Others knew him simply as the man who dared to stand toe-to-toe with the Mafia. He built one of the biggest drug empires America had ever seen, and then, one summer day in 1973, he vanished. No body, no arrest, no goodbye, just gone, like smoke slipping through the cracks. Before we get started, drop a comment and let me know, where are you tuning in from tonight? And what time is it where you are? I love seeing this little underworld of ours stretch across time zones. Oh, and if this is your first time here, go ahead and subscribe, ring that bell too. That way, you won't miss the next dive into the shadows. Now, take a breath. Let the noise of the day fade out. Follow me into the mystery. This is Outlaw Icons, your sleepy dawn. Chapter 1, The Disappearance. The summer of 1973 carried with it a heat that clung to the streets like a second skin. New York hummed with its usual mix of chaos and rhythm, sirens, subway rumbles, and the restless chatter of millions living stacked on top of one another. But behind the noise of the city, something far quieter was unfolding, a silence that would ripple across the underworld. On a July morning, Frank Matthews, the man they called Black Caesar, stepped off the edge of history. He was supposed to be preparing for trial, shackled by indictments that could have ended his life behind bars. Instead, he made a choice few dared even imagine. With an estimated $20 million at his fingertips, he walked out of the system, disappeared into the wind, and was never seen again. No body was ever recovered. No credible sightings confirmed. Not a single letter, phone call, or whisper to loved ones that he was alive. One of the richest and most powerful drug traffickers America had ever produced simply ceased to exist. For law enforcement, it was humiliation. For his rivals, it was confusion. And for his legend, it was birth. The question still lingers, like cigarette smoke in a closed room. How does a man with the entire federal government at his heels slip away so completely? The story begins not with his rise, but with his vanishing. Imagine the sight. A federal courtroom preparing for the trial of a man who once defied the Mafia itself. Agents shuffling papers, prosecutors convinced they finally had him cornered. Matthews was a jewel they wanted on their mantle, a symbol that no one was untouchable. But he never showed. His bail had been posted, his conditions set. He was expected to surrender, to face the music of the empire he had built. Instead, he vanished. It was as if he had stepped off a stage mid-performance, leaving the audience staring in an empty spotlight. Rumors bloomed instantly. Some said he slipped onto a plane bound for Africa, cash stacked in duffel bags. Others swore he was murdered by the Mafia, silenced for daring to cut into their business. A few whispered he reinvented himself in some Caribbean paradise, a ghost living under a new name while the world chased shadows. The truth was simpler and far more terrifying. The system had underestimated him. Matthews had not only money, but foresight. He had spent years studying the habits of the very people sworn to catch him. He knew their procedures, their blind spots, their bureaucracy. And he had the one thing even the richest gangsters often lacked, the will to vanish completely, to sever every tie that anchored him to his old life. In July 1973, he did just that. To understand why this disappearance was so shocking, you have to picture the scale of what he left behind. Frank Matthews wasn't just another hustler lost in the sea of New York's drug trade. He was the ocean itself. His network stretched across more than a dozen states. His operations pumped heroin and cocaine into cities from Philadelphia to Baltimore, from Newark to Atlanta. He handled amounts of money so staggering that even the Mafia took notice. He did not pay tribute. He did not bow. And that alone was extraordinary. In those days, the Italian mob ruled the drug corridors of the East Coast with an iron grip. Every hustler, every dealer, every aspiring kingpin was expected to funnel profits upward, like tributaries feeding a larger river. Matthews broke that rule. He stood as a dam against tradition, a man who not only refused to pay, but openly carved out a world where black drug lords could claim their own thrones. It was audacity that made him powerful. It was audacity that made him dangerous. And it was audacity that ultimately made his disappearance so unbelievable. Because men like him were not supposed to escape. When Matthews vanished, the newspapers had a field day. Headlines spoke of the Black Caesar on the run. Television anchors raised their eyebrows, as if even they could not believe what they were reading. Law enforcement scrambled. Marshals spread across airports and seaports, and agents whispered among themselves in frustration. How had he slipped the net? How had a man so visible, so infamous, just melted into thin air? The answer may lie in his last known days of freedom. Witnesses recalled his calm demeanor, as if trial did not weigh on his shoulders. He moved through life with the same quiet confidence that had carried him from the streets of Durham, North Carolina, to the penthouses of New York. There was no panic in his stride, no fear etched into his face. If anything, there was relief. Friends later admitted that he had spoken of leaving, of walking away before the system could chain him. But those words were always brushed aside as bravado. After all, where can a man go when the entire country was watching? The answer would soon prove itself. Anywhere he wanted. On that July day, Frank Matthews crossed a line few men have ever crossed. Most criminals, when faced with the full weight of the federal government, crumble. They take plea deals, they serve time, they try to hold on to scraps of power from inside a prison cell. Matthews chose something else. He chose freedom. He chose disappearance. And in doing so, he rewrote the rules. The myth was sealed almost instantly. Barbershops buzzed with theories. Street corners debated whether he had been killed or had outsmarted them all. Families of addicts cursed his name, while young hustlers admired his audacity. To some, he was a villain. To others, he was proof that the system could be beaten. But beneath the legend was a man, a flesh and blood figure who had grown up poor, who had chased power like a flame, who had outpaced both the Mafia and the government. His story was not just about drugs or money. It was about daring to build an empire in the shadows of America's greatest cities, and then daring to abandon it all. The disappearance was not the end of Frank Matthews. It was the beginning of his immortality. Imagine him on that final day, duffel bags heavy with cash, a lover by his side, the open world stretched before him. No more phone calls, no more meetings, no more answering to anyone, just silence and the endless possibilities of a new identity. Some say he stepped onto a plane and never looked back. Some believe he was buried in a shallow grave, his fortune stolen by those he trusted. Others cling to the hope that he still walks among us, a gray-haired man sipping coffee in a quiet town, his past hidden beneath the wrinkles of time. The truth is, nobody knows. That uncertainty is what makes his story so haunting. When a man dies, the book closes. When a man vanishes, the story lives forever. And Frank Matthews was the man who got away. The summer heat pressed on. The city moved forward. But somewhere, out there, a man who once held an empire in his palm had disappeared into the cracks of the world. The trail grew cold, the questions multiplied, and the legend spread like wildfire. Did he reinvent himself under another name? Did he find safety in foreign lands where extradition was impossible? Did he fall victim to betrayal, his body lost to the soil, and his riches swallowed by greed? Every possibility was equally believable and equally chilling. For law enforcement, it was a wound that never healed. Agents whispered about Matthews for decades, some convinced he was long dead, others obsessed with the idea of catching him, even if only as a ghost. For his rivals, it was a reminder that even the most powerful could slip away. And for the people on the streets, it was proof that legends are not always built in prison cells. They can be built in absence. Frank Matthews was gone, but his shadow remained. The disappearance in July 1973 was not just the closing act of a drug kingpin's reign. It was the opening scene of a mystery that has lingered for 50 years. A story that refuses to end, because endings require answers. And in the case of Frank Matthews, there are none. Only silence. Only speculation. Only the haunting image of a man stepping into the unknown, carrying a fortune, and never looking back. This is where the story begins, with a vanishing act so bold it defied the very idea of justice. With a man who stood against the Mafia, who outpaced the government, and who chose to disappear into history's shadows. Where he went, nobody can say. How he lived, nobody can prove. What became of his millions, nobody can trace. All that remains is the echo of his legend, whispered in corners, told in hushed voices, and remembered by those who marvel at the impossible. Frank Matthews, Black Caesar, the ghost who stole $20 million and vanished forever. And this is only the beginning. Because to understand how he reached that moment, to grasp why his disappearance stunned the nation, we have to go back. Back to the boy in Durham. Back to the streets of Brooklyn. Back to the choices that carved a path toward empire and exile. Only then can we follow the footsteps that led to his vanishing. And as we turn to that story, the question burns brighter than ever. Did Frank Matthews escape into freedom or into the grave? The silence still answers with nothing, and that silence is where our journey begins. Chapter 2: Roots in the South. Before Frank Matthews became the ghost who slipped from history, he was just a boy in the red clay of the American South. Long before the money, before the legend, before the manhunt that would stretch across continents, there was Durham, North Carolina, a tobacco town where the scent of cured leaves hung in the air, and opportunity was scarce for those born on the wrong side of the tracks. The year was 1944. The Second World War raged overseas, and factories in the South hummed with war contracts. But for black families in Durham, life was still marked by segregation, by the limits of Jim Crow, by invisible fences that dictated where you could eat, where you could work, and where you could dream. Into this world, Frank Matthews took his first breath. Imagine the landscape: dirt roads framed by shotgun houses, wooden porches where neighbors gathered to escape the suffocating heat, children playing barefoot until the streetlights flickered on. Durham was known for its tobacco companies and its modest black business district, but the wealth generated by those industries rarely trickled down. For most families, survival meant laboring in mills, working odd jobs, and stretching every penny to make it through the week. Frank's childhood was marked by absence as much as presence. His father died when he was young, leaving his mother to carry the weight of raising a family alone. She worked hard, but hard work did not erase poverty. Poverty left its mark in hunger, in patched clothes, in the quiet shame of never having quite enough. For Frank, those early years planted a seed of determination and of defiance. Even as a boy, he understood the rules of his world, rules that told him where he could walk, how he should act, and what he should never expect. But where others accepted, he questioned. Where others bowed their heads, he lifted his. The streets became his classroom, teaching him lessons no schoolbook could. It did not take long before those lessons turned into experiments. Small hustles, petty thefts, testing the boundaries of what he could get away with. The police knew his name before long, though he was still just a teenager. In Durham, brushes with the law were almost a rite of passage for boys who had nothing and wanted something. But for Frank, it wasn't just mischief. It was practice. Each risk he took was a rehearsal for a larger stage he hadn't yet imagined. Picture him, a wiry young man with sharp eyes and a smile that carried more confidence than his years should allow. He was already learning the art of charm, of persuasion, of carrying himself like he belonged in rooms he had no business entering. People followed him even then, not because he demanded it, but because something in his presence suggested he was already destined for more. Durham in the 1950s was a place of contradictions. On one side of town, the Black Wall Street district still carried echoes of prosperity, a reminder that black enterprise could flourish even in the shadow of oppression. On the other, poverty pressed down like a weight, pushing boys like Frank toward fast money and dangerous paths. He saw both worlds. He knew the respect that came with financial power, and he knew the desperation that came when that power was out of reach. He decided early on which side he wanted to stand. But deciding and achieving were two different things. The path from a poor Southern boy to a man who would later challenge the Mafia itself was not laid out in front of him. He would have to build it himself, brick by brick, risk by risk. And the first bricks were laid in Durham. By the mid-1950s, Frank's reputation in the neighborhood had already started to form. He wasn't just another kid in trouble. He was clever, calculating, always thinking 2 steps ahead. Where others might steal for the thrill, he stole with a plan. Where others wasted their gains, he reinvested. Back into the hustle, back into his own future. Still, the law caught up with him. Arrests came, short stints in juvenile facilities, stern lectures from judges who saw him as another statistic. But punishment did not break him. If anything, it sharpened him. Every encounter with authority taught him more about the system he would one day manipulate. Durham may not have known it then, but it was raising a boy who would go on to outthink the very institutions that claimed to hold power over him. His adolescence was not without its moments of normalcy. There were friends, laughter, young love, and the restless energy of youth. But beneath it all was a current pulling him forward, away from the small town that could never contain him. Durham was the soil, but Frank Matthews was already reaching towards something greater, something that would require him to leave behind the world of his childhood. Think of a seed cracking through the earth, fragile yet unstoppable. That was Frank in the late 1950s, growing in a place too small for his ambition. The town that raised him would not be the town that kept him. There's an old saying in the South, roots hold you down, but they also feed you. For Frank, the roots of Durham fed his hunger, his toughness, his refusal to accept limits. They gave him the grit that would one day carry him to the top of an empire. But they also left scars, scars of loss, of poverty, of injustice, that hardened him against the world. By 1959, Frank was 15 years old, already restless, already staring beyond the tobacco fields and mill jobs that defined so many lives around him. The city felt too small, the opportunities too few, the weight of expectation too heavy. He needed more, wanted more, and believed he deserved more. That belief would become his guiding star, even when it led him into darkness. The boy from Durham, shaped by poverty and sharpened by defiance, was preparing to leave behind the world of his youth. Ahead of him lay Brooklyn, the streets where he would transform from a restless teenager into a man of power. But leaving one world for another is never clean. He would carry his Southern roots with him always. The lessons, the scars, the hunger. And it was that hunger that would drive him forward. Frank Matthews had not yet become Black Caesar. He had not yet stood against the Mafia or vanished with millions. But in the clay roads and crowded porches of Durham, the outline of his future was already visible. The disappearance that stunned the world decades later began here, in the childhood of a boy who refused to be small. Because before a man can vanish, he must first appear. And Frank Matthews was about to step onto a stage far larger than Durham could ever provide. The South had given him his roots. Now the streets of New York would give him his wings. And once he spread them, nothing, no law, no rival, no tradition, would keep him from flying. But every flight carries risk. And every boy who grows into a king must decide how far he's willing to go before gravity calls him back down. In 1959, as Frank Matthews prepared to leave Durham behind, he had no idea just how high he would climb, or how far he would eventually fall. The streets of Brooklyn were waiting. The empire had not yet been built, but the first stones were already in his hands. The boy from the South was about to become something else entirely. And once that transformation began, there would be no turning back. Chapter 3. The Move to New York. The train screeched into the station, iron wheels grinding against steel tracks, the air thick with the smell of smoke and sweat. For a boy from Durham, North Carolina, it felt like stepping into another universe. Brooklyn in the early 1960s was alive with sound. Car horns, shouts from vendors, the hum of radios pouring music out onto stoops. It was a city that swallowed people whole. And yet, for some, it was also the place where legends were born. Frank Matthews arrived not as the Black Caesar of myth, but as a restless young man looking for something his hometown could never offer. He carried with him the toughness of the South, the scars of poverty, and the fire of ambition. New York didn't care who you were back home. It demanded you prove yourself all over again. And for Frank, that challenge was intoxicating. Imagine the streets he stepped into. Row houses crammed shoulder to shoulder, kids playing stickball under clotheslines strung across alleyways, men in sharp suits leaning against Cadillacs parked outside bars that never seemed to close. Brooklyn was a melting pot of struggle and hustle, a place where survival meant adapting fast. The neighborhoods pulsed with energy, but beneath the surface was a darker rhythm, one that moved to the beat of money, gambling, and crime. Numbers rackets thrived in corner candy shops. Backroom dice games whispered promises of quick fortune and quicker ruin. For a young man with sharp eyes and quicker hands, it was a training ground unlike any other. Frank was drawn to the action the way moths are drawn to flame. He watched men roll dice, watched cash change hands faster than the blink of an eye. He studied the way winners carried themselves, loud, cocky, untouchable, and the way losers carried their silence, swallowing anger and shame as they walked away empty. Gambling wasn't just a pastime in Brooklyn. It was a theater of human nature, and Frank was sitting front row. Soon, he wasn't just watching. He was part of it. First on the sidelines, holding bets, learning the rules. Then on the inside, throwing dice, stacking bills, getting a taste of the rush that came when luck and nerve collided. Every dollar won was proof that the world could bend to his will, even if just for a moment. But gambling was never just about chance. It was about control. The men who truly profited weren't the ones risking their paychecks on a roll of the dice. They were the ones running the games, holding the books, making sure the house always won. Frank saw that, and he wanted in. It started small, collecting bets, helping run numbers for local operators who noticed his sharpness and his reliability. In the numbers racket, community members placed small wagers on daily digits, hoping for a big payout. To outsiders, it looked like a harmless lottery. To insiders, it was an underground economy, moving serious money through the hands of men who understood both math and muscle. Frank fit right in. He had the discipline to handle the cash, the charisma to earn trust, and the quiet boldness to make people believe in him. Before long, he was no longer just another young hustler. He was someone to watch. Yet every move forward came with risk. The police knew about the games, sometimes raiding spots to send a message, sometimes turning a blind eye when the right palms were greased. Rivals lurked too, waiting for weakness, ready to snatch business the moment an operator slipped. For Frank, it was a crash course in power, the way it was gained, the way it was lost, and the way it had to be defended. Brooklyn hardened him in ways Durham never could. The stakes were higher, the rewards were larger, and the dangers were everywhere. Walking home at night, he could feel eyes on him, could sense when someone was sizing him up, wondering if he carried more cash than he should. He learned to read people like cards, spotting tells in their movements, their tones, their silences. It wasn't long before he realized that hustling in New York wasn't just about money. It was about reputation. In the streets, your name was your currency. If people believed you were strong, you were strong. If they believed you were weak, you were finished. Frank carried himself with a confidence that made others think twice. It was an armor that shielded him long before he had the power to back it up. Still, there were moments when the mask slipped. Nights when he sat alone, staring at the ceiling, wondering how far this path could take him. He wanted more than small-time rackets. He wanted more than dice games and backroom bets. He wanted an empire. And in New York, empires were built not on chance, but on crime. The early 1960s were a turning point in the city's underworld. Heroin was flooding the streets, carving out markets that dwarfed the gambling rackets of old. Small hustlers became dealers. Dealers became suppliers. And those bold enough to climb higher became kings. Frank watched closely. He saw how the trade operated, how heroin moved from international suppliers into the veins of addicts in Harlem, Brooklyn, and beyond. He saw how the Italian mob controlled much of the flow, taking their cut, enforcing their dominance. He also saw cracks in their grip. The Mafia was powerful, but it was also rigid, bound by rules and tradition. Frank wasn't bound by anything. He didn't owe respect to old systems. He didn't fear stepping into spaces others said were forbidden. In his mind, if there was money to be made, then it was his to take. Every step he took in the gambling world was leading him closer to that realization. Gambling gave him cash. Cash gave him connections. Connections gave him a window into the larger world of organized crime. By the mid-1960s, he was no longer just hustling on street corners. He was orbiting circles of men who handled real money, real power, and real danger. But success never comes without a cost. Frank's growing presence put him on the radar of both rivals and law enforcement. He was arrested more than once in those early years, usually on small charges, numbers running, gambling operations, petty hustles. Each time, he learned something new about police tactics, about the court system, about how far he could push before the consequences grew too heavy. What the courts didn't know was that they were shaping him into something more dangerous with every arrest. Each sentence, each lecture from a judge, each night behind bars added to his education. He was learning the system from the inside, memorizing its weak points, preparing for the day when he would outgrow its grasp entirely. Through it all, he remained calm. Friends later recalled how Frank rarely showed fear, even when the law had him cornered. He treated setbacks as lessons, failures as stepping stones. Where others saw walls, he saw doors waiting to be opened. By the time the 60s deepened, Frank Matthews had transformed. No longer the boy from Durham chasing dice games on Brooklyn corners. He was a young man with a vision. The city had tested him, and he had survived. More than that, he had thrived. But the question hung heavy. How far would he go? The lure of fast money had pulled countless men into early graves or long prison sentences. The streets were littered with ghosts of those who believed they could outplay the system. Frank saw them, knew their names, and still believed he was different. His ambition whispered that he was destined for something greater, something beyond the reach of the average hustler. And soon, he would find it. Because while gambling sharpened his instincts, it was drugs that would make his empire. The heroin that was cutting its way through New York in the 1960s was both a plague and a gold mine. And Frank Matthews was about to stake his claim. The dice games and numbers rackets had given him a foundation, but the drug trade promised skyscrapers. And Frank had no intention of being left on the ground. The move to New York had been the first leap. The next would be bigger, bolder, and infinitely more dangerous. As the decade marched on, the restless boy from Durham was vanishing. In his place stood a man whose ambition was as vast as the city itself. He had tasted power, and he wanted more. He had learned the rules, and now he was ready to break them. The city had tested his patience, and now it would test his nerve. And Frank Matthews was ready to play for higher stakes. The move to New York was never just about leaving Durham behind. It was about stepping onto a stage where the lights burned brighter, the risks cut deeper, and the rewards stretched beyond imagination. But in the shadows of those rewards waited betrayal, violence, and the heavy hand of the law. As Frank crossed the line from hustler to dealer, from numbers runner to drug lord, the stakes of his life would change forever. And with each step forward, the question grew louder. Would his ambition lift him to untouchable heights, or lead him straight into the abyss? The dice had been thrown, and there was no turning back. Chapter 4. First Hustles and Street Cred. The dice rattled across the floor, the sound echoing off brick walls and stairwells, followed by a hush of anticipation. Then came the slap of bills against the concrete, money folding into eager hands or sliding away into someone else's pocket. This was not Las Vegas. This was not Atlantic City. This was Brooklyn in the early 1960s, Bedford-Stuyvesant, where backroom gambling and street corners doubled as the stock exchanges of the poor. For Frank Matthews, it was the perfect classroom. The lessons weren't written on chalkboards. They played out in whispers, in the way money moved, in the way men stood taller after a win or shrank after a loss. Trust was fragile, loyalty was bought and sold, and everything had a price. By now, Frank had already proven himself in small gambling circles. He wasn't the loudest voice in the room, but he was steady, reliable, and smart. That mattered. In the streets, a man's reputation wasn't built overnight. It was built coin by coin, hand by hand, and always under the watchful eyes of those who were waiting to see if he would stumble. Numbers running became his first real hustle. In neighborhoods like Bed-Stuy, the numbers game was more than just illegal gambling. It was entertainment. It was hope. It was a chance for working-class families to dream, even if the odds were stacked against them. For just a few cents, someone could pick a 3-digit number and pray it matched the one drawn the next day. The payout might be small compared to today's lotteries, but to a housewife or a factory worker living paycheck to paycheck, it could mean groceries, rent, or a new coat for a child. On the surface, it looked harmless, but behind the scenes, the numbers racket was a machine generating serious money and funneling it through operators who controlled territories like fiefdoms. Matthew started on the lower rungs of that ladder, collecting bets, memorizing figures, delivering envelopes. It was tedious work, but it placed him inside the bloodstream of the city's underground economy. The job demanded trust. Runners held other people's dreams in their hands, tiny scraps of paper with numbers scrawled in pencil, each one carrying the weight of hope. Losing a bet slip could mean losing respect, and in the streets, respect was life. Frank never lost them. He treated each slip like it was gold, and that reliability didn't go unnoticed. But reliability was only the beginning. What separated Frank from the rest was his ability to see beyond the surface. While other runners counted slips, he counted patterns. He watched how money flowed, how operators skimmed off the top, how the house always seemed to stay ahead. He studied the hierarchy of the racket the way a chess player studies the board, learning where the power sat and how it could be moved. Soon, his role began to expand. He wasn't just a runner anymore. He was handling more bets, moving more money, and gaining access to conversations that hinted at bigger opportunities. Word spread that the kid from Durham had the brains to match his ambition, and in Bed-Stuy, brains and ambition were a dangerous combination. But the streets offered more than numbers. Drugs were spreading like wildfire. Heroin, in particular, was tightening its grip on New York, seeping into every corner, from Harlem to Brooklyn, from addicts in tenement stairwells to the dealers getting rich off their misery. It was a trade far riskier than numbers running, but it was also a trade that promised far greater rewards. Frank dipped his toe into that world carefully. He began with small deals, packets sold on corners, a few dollars at a time. He kept his hands clean when he could, letting others do the actual handoffs, but he made sure the money flowed back to him. He understood the risks. One bad deal could mean prison, or worse, a bullet, but he also understood the potential. In those early days, every transaction was a gamble, every meeting a test. He watched addicts shuffle up, desperation in their eyes, the kind of desperation that made them both loyal and dangerous. He saw how quickly drugs could turn friends into enemies, families into strangers. Yet he also saw the power it gave those who controlled the supply. To outsiders, it might have looked like greed. To Frank, it was survival. The South had taught him hunger. Brooklyn was teaching him appetite. And appetite, once fed, only grows. Step by step, he built his reputation. He wasn't reckless. He wasn't flashy. He moved like a man who understood that every eye on the block could be a threat or an opportunity. He wore confidence like a suit, not because he had earned it yet, but because he knew he would. And in the streets, appearance mattered almost as much as reality. People began to trust him with more money, more product, more responsibility. And with each test, he delivered. His circle widened, his influence spread, and soon he was no longer just another hustler trying to survive. He was a name people knew, a man others looked to for guidance, for work, for protection. Bedford-Stuyvesant was a community of contradictions. It was jazz pouring out of open windows, children playing hopscotch on sidewalks, church choirs filling Sunday mornings with hope. But it was also poverty, crime, and violence simmering beneath the surface. Frank walked both sides of that reality. By day, he could blend in with neighbors, another young man navigating the grind. By night, he was building a network that would one day stretch across states. The respect he gained wasn't just about money. It was about presence. When Frank walked into a room, people noticed. He didn't need to shout. He didn't need to throw his weight around. His calmness spoke louder than any display of aggression. He listened more than he talked, and when he did speak, his words carried weight. That quality, the ability to command attention without demanding it, was what began to set him apart. Still, danger lurked at every turn. Rivals watched, waiting for a slip. Police patrolled, always eager to make an example. And the Mafia, the shadow looming over every racket in the city, kept a close eye on anyone who seemed too bold, too ambitious, too unwilling to fall in line. Frank's rise in Bed-Stuy did not go unnoticed by them, but he didn't flinch. If anything, the threat only sharpened his resolve. He believed he could walk a path others were too afraid to take. Where others saw lines drawn by tradition, he saw opportunities waiting to be seized. And so, his reputation grew, not just as a hustler, but as a man who could be trusted, a man who could deliver, a man who might one day be more than the sum of his hustles. The streets were watching. The operators were watching. Even the law was watching. Every bet he collected, every packet he sold, every dollar he stacked was another brick in the foundation of the empire he would one day rule. And though he didn't yet know it, those bricks were leading him toward a destiny larger than anyone could imagine. Frank Matthews was still years away from becoming the Black Caesar who would defy the Mafia and vanish with $20 million. But in the streets of Bedford-Stuyvesant, in the shadows of dice games and drug deals, the legend was already taking shape. The boy from Durham had found his stage, and now he was ready to perform. But the stage lights burn hot, and in the underworld, every rise comes with a price. The question was not whether Frank could climb higher. The question was whether he could survive the climb. Because with every hustle, every deal, every new connection, the stakes grew sharper, the risks grew deadlier. And soon, he would face choices that would determine not just his future, but his very survival. The streets had given him his start, but the streets also had a way of eating their own. And Frank Matthews was about to find out just how hungry they could be. Chapter 5. The heroin era begins. The package hit the table with a soft thud, wrapped tight, innocent-looking, no bigger than a loaf of bread. But inside was a powder that would change lives, poison veins, and build empires. In the late 1960s, heroin was not just another hustle in New York. It was the storm that swept through entire neighborhoods, leaving wreckage in its wake. And for Frank Matthews, it was the moment the game changed forever. He had made his name in numbers and small-time deals, but the stakes were limited. Gambling paid bills and earned respect, but it wasn't enough to build the kind of empire Frank dreamed about. The real money, the kind of money that bought mansions and silenced enemies, was flowing through the heroin trade. It was a pipeline of cash running straight through New York's veins, and Matthews wasn't about to stand on the sidelines. He studied the market the way a general studies a battlefield. He saw the demand rising, saw addicts crowding corners, their hunger growing with every hit. He saw the profits piling into the hands of those bold enough to take the risk. And he saw something else, opportunity. The Mafia had long dominated the heroin routes. They controlled shipments, guarded connections, enforced tribute from anyone daring to deal in their shadow. But power breeds arrogance, and arrogance leaves openings. The mob treated black dealers as underlings, men allowed to profit only so long as they paid respect and kept within invisible boundaries. Frank Matthews never believed in boundaries. So when heroin began flooding into the streets of New York, he decided to step in, not as a runner, not as a middleman, but as a boss in his own right. The first deals were small. A few ounces here, a few ounces there, sold through trusted hands in Bed-Stuy. But heroin is not like dice games or betting slips. It multiplies fast. A single ounce could be cut into dozens of street-level packets, each one flipping into quick profit. The math was irresistible. Every dollar invested seemed to return tenfold. And Matthews, ever the strategist, knew that once he built a foothold, he could climb the entire ladder. He watched the addicts carefully, not with pity, but with precision. Their need was insatiable, their loyalty unshakable. Once hooked, they came back day after day, desperate to feed a hunger that never ended. It was cruel, but it was also business. And in the streets of Brooklyn, cruelty and business often walked hand in hand. As his supply grew, so did his reputation. He was no longer just a hustler running numbers in backrooms. He was moving product that reshaped lives, that shifted power, that caught the attention of men who rarely looked twice at small-time operators. Matthews was stepping into a world far larger, far more dangerous, and infinitely more profitable. The heroin era was ruthless. Violence stalked every corner. Addicts robbed their own families. Dealers killed over turf. Cops cracked down hard, but their efforts often felt like pouring water on a fire fed by gasoline. The more the system tried to control it, the more the trade spread underground, adapting, surviving, thriving. And in that chaos, Matthews rose. He carried himself differently now. No longer the cautious teenager from Durham, no longer the fresh face in Brooklyn dice games. He was a man who understood the rhythm of the streets, who knew how to move money, how to keep crews loyal, how to keep eyes on him without ever saying too much. His confidence wasn't loud. It was steady, grounded, like a river carving its way through rock. People followed him not out of fear, but out of belief. They believed he could deliver. They believed he could protect. They believed he was destined to rise higher than anyone else in their world. But every rise carries risk. The Mafia noticed. Law enforcement noticed. Rivals noticed. Everyone was watching this young man who seemed unafraid to step into territory others avoided. Some respected him. Others resented him. All of them understood that he was no longer just another hustler. He was a threat. Frank's genius lay not just in ambition, but in organization. He ran his operation with discipline, structuring it like a business. Money flowed in, product flowed out, and he kept both moving with remarkable efficiency. To him, heroin was not just a drug. It was an industry, and he intended to master it. By the late 1960s, heroin had already begun to tear through communities like a plague. Families crumbled, children went hungry, funerals multiplied. Politicians railed against it. Newspapers printed headlines of despair, yet the trade only grew. And behind that growth were men like Matthews, men who saw in the destruction not tragedy, but opportunity. He justified it the way many in his position did. If he didn't sell it, someone else would. The streets would always demand, and the supply would always find its way. Better, he thought, for him to control it, smarter, sharper, more disciplined, than to let chaos rule. It was a convenient lie, but it kept the machine running. As the years ticked forward, his influence expanded beyond Brooklyn. What began as a local hustle was transforming into a regional network. He was building connections that stretched from Harlem to Philadelphia, from Newark to Baltimore. Each new city was another domino falling, another piece of the puzzle sliding into place. But with expansion came heat. Police stings intensified. Informants whispered names. Arrests climbed. Matthews managed to avoid the worst of it, staying one step ahead, careful with his movements, cautious with his words. But he knew the spotlight was turning his way. He could feel it in the way strangers lingered too long, in the way conversations fell silent when he walked into a room. Heroin was a double-edged sword. It built wealth at lightning speed, but it drew danger just as quickly. Frank Matthews had chosen his path, and now he had to walk it, knowing full well that each step forward carried him deeper into the crosshairs of both rivals and the law. Yet he didn't flinch. If anything, the danger only fueled him. Every obstacle became proof that he was destined to rise higher, that his empire was inevitable. He believed he could outsmart the Mafia, outmaneuver the cops, outlast the chaos of the streets. And for a time he did. The heroin era was his crucible. It burned away hesitation, burned away caution, leaving only the man who would one day stand at the top of one of the largest drug empires in American history. But power has a way of demanding more. And heroin, once it grips, never lets go. The trade that built him was also the trade that threatened to destroy him. The late 1960s ended with Matthews on the rise. His name whispered with equal parts fear and admiration. He was no longer the boy from Durham. He was no longer the young hustler running numbers in Brooklyn. He was becoming something else entirely, a kingpin in the making. But kings attract enemies. And as the new decade dawned, the stakes would rise higher, the risks sharper, the rewards unimaginable. The boy who had once run slips of paper in the numbers racket was now dealing in powder that could buy mansions or bury men. Heroin had given him his empire's foundation. But empires built on poison rarely stand forever. And soon, Frank Matthews would find himself staring down forces far larger, far more dangerous than even he could control. The heroin era had begun, and Frank Matthews was about to claim his throne. Chapter 6. Outgrowing the local scene. The packages no longer stayed in Brooklyn. They moved like rivers flowing out of the borough, spreading into cities along the eastern seaboard. Philadelphia, Newark, Baltimore, each one a hub of its own, each one a city with its own rhythms, its own dangers, its own hunger for heroin. And Frank Matthews was ready to feed it. By the late 1960s, his name carried weight in Brooklyn, but weight alone wasn't enough. Local hustlers could make money. Local bosses could carve out a block or two. But Frank wanted more. He wanted a network so wide, so deeply rooted, that no one man, no one raid, no one arrest could topple it. He wanted to turn street corners into highways, neighborhoods into territories, cities into his empire. It began in Philadelphia. The city was fertile ground, big enough to sustain serious business, fractured enough for an outsider to move in if he had the nerve. Frank made his introductions carefully, relying on the charisma that had already earned him trust back home. He understood that expansion wasn't about barging in. It was about planting seeds. A few trusted lieutenants. A few reliable distributors. Once the product hit the streets and the money flowed, the rest followed. Philadelphia welcomed him in whispers. Addicts whispered about the stronger product. Dealers whispered about the new source who seemed fearless. The whispers grew, and soon, his presence in the city was undeniable. But one city wasn't enough. Baltimore came next, a port town where goods flowed in and out, and where poverty left entire neighborhoods vulnerable to the lure of heroin. Frank saw the same pattern everywhere he looked. Desperation bred dependence. Dependence bred profit. And profit, when channeled with discipline, bred power. He sent men he trusted, men loyal enough to stake his reputation on. They set up shop, found corners, built connections with locals who knew the terrain. Every day, money returned north, flowing back into Frank's pockets, while his name spread further down the coast. Newark followed, then other hubs. The pattern was always the same. Move quietly. Establish trust. Flood the streets. Let the product speak louder than threats ever could. By the time rivals noticed, by the time police scrambled to respond, Matthews had already locked in his foundation. What made him different from others wasn't just ambition. It was vision. Most dealers thought in blocks, maybe neighborhoods if they were lucky. Matthews thought in states. He saw the East Coast not as scattered cities, but as pieces of a single chessboard. Each city he moved into became another piece under his control, another move toward checkmate. With expansion came new problems. Territory meant turf wars. Turf wars meant blood. Rivals tried to test him, some with words, some with bullets. But Frank knew when to strike and when to step back. Violence was never his first choice, but it was never off the table. He believed in control, and control sometimes required fear. Law enforcement began to notice. Arrest records in Philadelphia linked back to Brooklyn. Raids in Baltimore turned up names tied to Matthews. But he was always one step removed, careful to insulate himself. He was the man in the shadows, pulling strings while others took the risks. It was a strategy that mirrored corporations more than street gangs. He ran his operation like a business. Each city was a branch office, each distributor a manager, each dealer an employee. And like any good businessman, he knew the value of loyalty and the cost of betrayal. Those under him respected his discipline. He wasn't reckless. He didn't flaunt power for the sake of ego. He built quietly, steadily, letting his network grow like roots beneath the surface. By the time authorities realized how far those roots stretched, it was already too late. Money poured in, more than he had ever imagined back in Durham, more than the numbers racket or dice games had ever offered. The figures ballooned so quickly it almost felt unreal. Tens of thousands turned to hundreds of thousands. Hundreds of thousands turned into millions. But money was more than luxury. It was leverage. It bought loyalty. It bought silence. It bought the ability to expand further without drawing unnecessary fire. It also bought attention from enemies, from police, from a mafia who had long believed heroin was their domain. The mob had tolerated small-time hustlers, men who played their roles and paid their dues. Matthews was different. He didn't ask for permission. He didn't pay tribute. He stepped directly into markets they considered theirs and took them for himself. It was a dangerous gamble, but one fueled by confidence. He believed the mafia underestimated him, dismissed him as another upstart who would burn out or get buried. And for a while they did. But as his reach grew, their patience thinned. In the streets, people began to talk about him differently. He wasn't just a hustler anymore. He was a boss, a man building something bigger than anyone thought possible, a man who seemed untouchable. But power comes with isolation. The higher he climbed, the fewer people he could trust. Betrayal became a constant threat, suspicion a daily companion. Every handshake carried risk. Every conversation could be an opening for law enforcement or rivals. And still, he pressed forward, because to stop was to fall. By the end of the decade, his network stretched across the East Coast like a web. Philadelphia, Baltimore, Newark, and beyond. They all fed back to Brooklyn, back to Matthews. His empire was growing, his wealth multiplying, his legend spreading. But legends are fragile. One wrong move, one crack in the foundation, and the empire could crumble. He knew it. The law knew it. His enemies knew it. The question was no longer whether Frank Matthews could outgrow the local scene. He already had. The question was how far he was willing to go before the walls closed in. Because expansion comes at a cost. More cities meant more exposure. More exposure meant more heat. And more heat meant more eyes staring into the shadows where Frank Matthews stood. The man who had once been just another hustler in Bed-Stuy was now something else entirely. A kingpin whose empire stretched across states. But kings draw fire, and the fire was coming. Chapter 7. The Rise of Black Caesar. The whispers came first. They started on street corners, passed quietly from one hustler to the next. Then they spread into gambling parlors, barbershops, and backrooms across the East Coast. By the early 1970s, the whispers had become a name. Black Caesar, a name that carried weight, a name that carried fear, and a name that would mark Frank Matthews as something far more than a local kingpin. It wasn't given to him lightly. Nicknames in the underworld were earned, not chosen. They were born out of reputation, out of myth, out of the way a man bent the world around him. Black Caesar spoke to something bigger than the streets of Brooklyn. It spoke to a man who ruled with the presence of an emperor, a man who built an empire in defiance of the rules that had governed crime in America for decades. By the dawn of the new decade, Matthews had turned expansion into dominance. Philadelphia, Baltimore, Newark, they weren't outposts anymore. They were strongholds, feeding his operation like arteries feeding a heart. His network moved heroin and cocaine across state lines with such efficiency that even federal agents admitted, grudgingly, that Matthews had built one of the most sophisticated organizations they had ever seen. And it wasn't just about the drugs. It was about the structure. Matthews ran his empire like a corporation, with layers of insulation between himself and the street-level deals. Crews in each city operated semi-independently, but always answered upward. Money flowed like a tide, swelling into millions. Each dollar stacked was another reminder that he had risen from Durham's clay roads into a man who could rival the Mafia's grip on the East Coast. But money wasn't the only marker of his rise. It was the respect. In the streets, his name carried a weight that no arrest record could erase. Young hustlers looked up to him, seeing in his story proof that ambition could rewrite destiny. Rivals sized him up with equal parts admiration and fear, knowing that across him was to risk everything. Even the Mafia, long accustomed to treating black dealers as subordinates, could no longer ignore him. Matthews had forced himself into their conversation, not by asking permission, but by taking what he wanted. He dressed the part too. Sharp suits, expensive cars, a lifestyle that spoke of wealth without needing to brag. He wasn't reckless with his image, but he knew the value of appearances. In a world where perception was reality, he carried himself like royalty. Calm, confident, untouchable. Yet beneath the polished surface was a man constantly calculating, constantly watching. He knew his empire was vast, but he also knew it was fragile. The same reach that brought him wealth brought him risk. Each new city was another set of enemies, another set of eyes that could betray him, another crack through which law enforcement could slip. He trusted few, and with reason. Still, the rise felt unstoppable. His organization moved millions in product, generating profits so staggering that even his own men sometimes struggled to comprehend them. It wasn't just money. It was power, pure and undeniable. He had carved out a place for himself at the very top of America's criminal underworld. But power has a way of demanding more. And Frank Matthews, for all his discipline, was not immune to ambition's pull. He wanted his empire to stretch further. He wanted more cities, more control, more recognition. He wanted to build something that would last, something that would stand as a monument to his audacity. The name Black Caesar reflected that hunger. Caesar had been a conqueror, a ruler who defied tradition, who seized power even when others believed it was impossible. Matthews embraced the comparison. Like Caesar, he believed his destiny was not to follow the rules of others, but to create his own. Law enforcement, meanwhile, scrambled to keep pace. Federal agencies knew Matthews was no longer just a street dealer. He was operating at a level that rivaled international cartels, pulling in shipments that stretched far beyond Brooklyn. But catching him was another matter. He kept himself insulated, surrounded by layers of loyal men who took the risks while he collected the rewards. Arrests came, indictments came, but Matthews always seemed to slip through the cracks, untouched, untouchable. The frustration among agents grew. They wanted him. They needed him. Taking down Black Caesar would be more than just another bust. It would be a statement, proof that no man, no matter how bold, could rise above the system. But Matthews made them wait. The streets, however, were less patient. Rivals bristled at his dominance, at his refusal to bend, at his unwillingness to pay tribute to the Mafia. Some plotted against him. Some tried to muscle in. Some simply hoped to see him fall. But Frank Matthews had built his reputation on more than money. He had built it on a quiet ruthlessness, on a willingness to defend his empire when pushed. Violence was not his language of choice, but when he spoke it, the message was clear. Those who crossed him rarely crossed him twice. By the early 1970s, Matthews had become something larger than a man. He was a myth in motion, a story told in whispers, a figure who seemed to embody both the promise and the peril of ambition. Black Caesar wasn't just a nickname, it was a crown. And Frank wore it with the confidence of someone who believed it had been waiting for him all along. But crowns are heavy, and the higher he rose, the more precarious his position became. Every move forward drew more attention, more enemies, more pressure from law enforcement. His empire was vast, but it was also vulnerable. One betrayal, one mistake, one unlucky break could send it crashing down. Still, Frank pressed on. The money was too good, the power too intoxicating, the legend too close to let go. He believed he could outthink his enemies, outmaneuver the cops, outlast the chaos. For a time, he was right. His empire grew, His wealth multiplied. His name spread further and further. But legends rarely live in peace. The story of Black Caesar was still climbing, still reaching toward its peak. And as every rise has shown, the higher the climb, the sharper the fall. The world was watching now. The Mafia, law enforcement, rivals, allies. Everyone had their eyes on Frank Matthews. And though no one could see it yet, the cracks were beginning to form. The rise of Black Caesar was complete, but the descent was waiting. Chapter 8. The Scope of the Empire. The map of the United States looked different when traced by heroin routes. Lines of powder cut across state borders, carving arteries of addiction from Brooklyn all the way down to the south, stretching north into New England, bleeding west toward Ohio. And at the center of it all, orchestrating the flow like a conductor leading an orchestra, was Frank Matthews. By the early 1970s, his empire had grown so vast that even seasoned investigators struggled to comprehend it. This wasn't a corner operation. This wasn't a neighborhood gang. Matthews controlled heroin and cocaine distribution across more than a dozen states, his reach rivaling, and in some places surpassing, the grip of the Italian Mafia. It is difficult to overstate the scale. Imagine a corporation with branch offices in every major East Coast city, each one staffed with managers, employees, and accountants. Now replace the products on the shelves with bricks of heroin, with kilos of cocaine, with cash stacked in hidden basements. That was Matthews's world, a business built on poison, but run with the precision of Wall Street. Brooklyn remained his capital. The pulse of Bed-Stuy was his command center, the place where orders were whispered, where money was counted, where loyalty was tested. From there, the veins of his empire stretched outward. Philadelphia became a critical hub, pumping steady revenue into his network. Baltimore was another artery, its port city status making it both lucrative and volatile. Newark became a fortress, fiercely guarded, essential to maintaining control in New Jersey. Further south, Matthews expanded into Washington, D.C., Atlanta, and beyond. Each city required delicate maneuvering. Local dealers had to be won over, sometimes with charm, sometimes with intimidation. Crews had to be trained, trusted, and kept in line. But once established, the system ran with remarkable efficiency. Product moved down the line, cash flowed back up, and Matthews stood at the top, invisible to many but undeniable to all. What made his empire unique was not just its size, but its independence. The Mafia had long dictated the terms of the heroin trade in America. They controlled supply chains, demanded tribute, enforced obedience. Matthews broke that mold. He refused to bow. He refused to pay. He carved out his empire not as a junior partner to the mob, but as a rival standing on equal ground. This was audacity bordering on madness. Men who had tried before him were buried quickly, their names forgotten, their bodies reminders of the price of defiance. But Matthews had something others lacked: discipline. He didn't flaunt his wealth recklessly. He didn't draw unnecessary attention. He built quietly, steadily, always one step ahead of those who might seek to cut him down. Still, his rise did not go unnoticed. The Mafia watched with a mix of anger and respect. Law enforcement grew, increasingly desperate, and on the streets, his legend only grew. To many, he was living proof that the old order could be defied, that a black man from Durham could stand shoulder to shoulder with the most powerful crime families in America, and not just survive, but thrive. His empire was measured not only in territory, but in money. Federal agents later estimated that Matthews moved tens of millions of dollars every year. The cash came in waves, flooding into his organization, more than most banks in small towns handled. Counting it was an operation in itself, a nightly ritual in apartments where bills stacked higher than furniture. Money like that changes everything. It buys houses in the suburbs, cars that gleamed under city lights, women who clung to the allure of power. It bought lawyers, too, ready to defend him when charges came, smoothing over legal troubles that might have crippled lesser men. And it bought silence. Police officers who looked the other way, neighbors who never saw anything, associates who stayed loyal because they knew betrayal would never be worth it. Yet beneath the glamour was a darker truth. Every dollar was soaked in the misery of addicts, in families torn apart, in violence that shadowed every deal. Matthews knew it. He wasn't blind. He saw the funerals, the overdoses, the bodies left in alleys. But like many in his position, he compartmentalized. To him, it was business. Cold, ruthless business. And in business, profit outweighed conscience. As the empire expanded, so did the risks. Federal agencies began pooling resources, sharing intelligence across states, recognizing that Matthews was not just a local problem, but a national one. They tapped phones, flipped informants, followed trails of cash. Still, he stayed out of reach, careful to remain insulated, cautious in his movements, always aware that one careless word could undo everything. Inside his empire, discipline was key. Crews were expected to deliver, to keep product moving, to ensure money flowed upward without interruption. Failure was not tolerated. Loyalty was rewarded, betrayal punished swiftly. Matthews built his organization on a foundation of both fear and respect, ensuring that those beneath him understood their place and their role. What set him apart was his ability to balance those forces. Too much fear, and men turn reckless. Too much leniency, and men grow complacent. Matthews walked the line, keeping his lieutenants motivated, loyal, and terrified of letting him down. The nickname Black Caesar spread further, carried from city to city, from dealer to dealer, until it became synonymous with power. He was not just another name in the underworld. He was a figure who reshaped it, who showed that the old hierarchies could be broken, that the game could be played on his terms. But even as he stood at the height of his power, shadows gathered. Expansion had made him untouchable in some ways, but vulnerable in others. The more cities he controlled, the more chances there were for betrayal, for mistakes, for cracks to form in the armor. And cracks did form. Informants whispered to law enforcement. Rivals schemed in backrooms. Agents plotted strategies to finally bring him down. Matthews may have believed he could outthink them all, but the walls were slowly closing in. For now, though, he reigned. His empire stretched across more than a dozen states, a vast network of drugs and money that made him one of the most powerful traffickers in American history. Black Caesar had risen, had seized his throne, had built an empire in defiance of the Mafia itself. But empires rarely last forever. The bigger they grow, the more fragile they become. And Frank Matthews's empire, vast as it was, carried within it the seeds of its own destruction. The scope of his power was undeniable. The scope of his risk was even greater. And soon, both would collide. Chapter 9: International Connections. The meeting was quiet, almost ordinary. A rented room, a table, men speaking in low voices. No guns drawn, no shouting, no chaos. But in that silence, history shifted. Frank Matthews was no longer satisfied with ruling the East Coast. He wanted the world. And to do that, he needed to cut out the middlemen who had dominated the drug trade for decades. He needed to go international. By the early 1970s, Matthews's empire was vast, but it was still chained to the Mafia. They controlled the supply routes. They had the connections to Europe, to Cuba, to South America. Every kilo of heroin, every brick of cocaine that reached his streets came at a cost, taxed by men who despised him, who tolerated his rise only because he made the money. Frank despised paying tribute. He believed it made him small. And Frank Matthews was not small. He studied the supply chain like a man dissecting an enemy. The French Connection had been the golden artery of heroin for years, funneling product from Turkey through Marseille, into New York, and across the country. The Italians treated it like their crown jewel. But Matthews saw something they didn't. He saw an opportunity to build his own crown. Connections began to form. Whispers of meetings with Dominican suppliers, men who moved product through the Caribbean into New York. Rumors of Cuban traffickers offering cocaine routes, eager to profit in the wake of revolution and exile. Each new link was a chance to sidestep the Mafia, to take their profit and make it his own. For Matthews, these weren't just deals. They were declarations. Every handshake with a Dominican contact was a signal to the Mafia that he didn't need them. Every whispered promise from a Cuban trafficker was proof that the old order was breaking. Every ounce of heroin or cocaine he sourced without Italian approval was another stone pulled from the foundation of their empire. It was audacity of the highest order. The Mafia had killed men for less. Yet Matthews pressed forward, fearless, driven by the same hunger that had carried him from Durham to Brooklyn to the throne of Black Caesar. He believed the future belonged to those bold enough to seize it. International suppliers saw in Matthews something rare. He was disciplined, organized, wealthy, and, most importantly, hungry. They didn't need to deal with layers of mafia politics, with men who demanded respect before business. Matthews cared only about efficiency. He made deals quickly, honored them reliably, and moved product faster than anyone else in the game. For suppliers, he was the perfect partner. The French connection, in particular, fascinated him. Heroin refined in Europe, packaged in Marseille, shipped across the Atlantic like cargo hidden in plain sight. Once in America, it could be cut, distributed, multiplied into fortunes. For years, the Mafia had guarded that route like treasure. But Matthews found ways to edge closer, to build relationships that allowed him to tap into the supply directly. Every move he made toward independence was a gamble. If the Mafia discovered too much, if they decided he had crossed too far, blood would spill. But Frank believed his empire gave him protection. He wasn't a small-time hustler they could erase without consequence. He was too big, too important, too visible. Any move against him risked destabilizing the entire East Coast trade. And so, he dared. The Dominican networks became particularly vital. The island had long been a corridor for product moving into the States, its proximity to New York making it an ideal launch point. Matthews cultivated relationships there, sending trusted men to negotiate, to oversee shipments, to ensure that product flowed without interference. The deals were risky, but the payoff was enormous. Each successful shipment strengthened his independence, weakened the Mafia's grip, and widened his empire's reach. The Cubans offered something different: cocaine. At the time, heroin was king in the streets, but cocaine was rising, its aura tied to glamour rather than desperation. Matthews understood trends before they became waves. He saw in cocaine the promise of a new market, one that could elevate him even higher. He didn't abandon heroin. Too much money was at stake, but he diversified. Cocaine became another weapon in his arsenal, another stream of profit feeding his empire. What made Matthews' international dealings remarkable wasn't just the audacity of defying the Mafia. It was the speed with which he adapted. He moved like water, filling gaps, exploiting weaknesses, flowing wherever opportunity opened. One month he was in Brooklyn, overseeing operations. The next, he was sending men to the Caribbean, arranging shipments. Always moving, always adjusting, always one step ahead. Law enforcement grew increasingly alarmed. Investigators who had once dismissed him as a local kingpin now saw something else entirely. A man building a transnational network, bypassing traditional structures, rivaling the Mafia on its own turf. Reports described him as one of the most powerful drug traffickers in America, his empire stretching across borders, his reach unmatched by any black dealer in history. And yet, for all his success, danger loomed like a shadow. Every international deal carried risks that dwarfed those of street-level hustling. One slip in customs, one betrayal by contact, one shipment intercepted. The consequences could unravel everything. Matthews knew it, but he played the game anyway. Because the rewards, millions flowing in faster than they could be counted, were worth it. Associates later recalled his confidence. He spoke of independence as if it were destiny, as if the Mafia's time as gatekeepers of the drug trade was ending, and he was the man who would end it. There was pride in his tone, but also a defiance that bordered on dangerous arrogance. The Mafia, of course, did not ignore him. They watched as his empire grew, as his connections deepened, as his refusal to pay tribute became an insult too loud to ignore. Some whispered that contracts were considered, that meetings were held, that plans to eliminate him surfaced, and then fell silent. Whether fear of his empire stayed their hand, or whether Matthews maneuvered too carefully, remains unclear. But one truth was undeniable. He had declared war without firing a shot. For Frank Matthews, the international stage was not just about drugs. It was about legitimacy. He wanted to prove that he could operate on the same level as the Italians, the Colombians, the French. He wanted to stand not as a subordinate, but as an equal. And for a time, he did. But ambition is a dangerous drug. The more he tasted independence, the more he craved. And the more he craved, the more reckless the game became. Each new connection, each new shipment, each new deal was another spin of the wheel, another chance for everything to collapse. The early 1970s marked the peak of his empire. He controlled heroin and cocaine across a dozen states. He sourced product from international suppliers. He defied the Mafia and survived. He made millions upon millions, his fortune rivaling that of the most powerful crime figures in the country. Black Caesar had risen higher than anyone thought possible. But the higher the climb, the sharper the fall. Because international connections, while profitable, drew heat like nothing else. Federal agencies expanded their investigations, pooling intelligence across borders. The Mafia sharpened its knives, no longer content to watch from the sidelines. Rivals plotted, waiting for the moment when Matthews's luck would finally run out. He believed he could outlast them all. He believed his empire was too strong, his vision too sharp, his discipline too tight. But empires built on defiance rarely stand unchallenged. Frank Matthews had taken his throne. He had stretched his reach across oceans, across borders, across entire states. He had shown the world that the rules could be broken, that the Mafia's grip could be defied. But the cost of defiance was closing in. And soon, Black Caesar would face the reckoning that comes to every king. Chapter 10, Clash with the Mob. The warning came not with bullets, but with words. A quiet message carried across a table, delivered by men who never needed to raise their voices. The Mafia was watching. The Mafia was waiting. And the Mafia expected tribute. For decades, the Cosa Nostra had operated like kings in the shadows. Their rules were simple. If you wanted to move drugs in New York, you paid. If you wanted to live, you respected their authority. If you forgot either of those, you were reminded, sometimes with a phone call, sometimes with a funeral. But Frank Matthews wasn't built for tribute. He had clawed his way out of Durham's clay roads, carved an empire across more than a dozen states, and built international connections that bypassed the very men now demanding payment. To bend his knee now, after everything he had created, felt like surrender. And surrender was not in his blood. He listened to their words, nodded at their warnings, but when the meeting ended, nothing had changed. He would not pay. That decision, simple in the moment, devastating in its consequence, was a declaration of war. Not a war fought with armies or headlines, but with whispers, with grudges, with knives in the dark. The Mafia wasn't used to being told no. But Matthews told them anyway. The audacity of his refusal rippled across the underworld. Hustlers whispered that Black Caesar had stood toe-to-toe with men others wouldn't even look in the eye. Some said it was madness. Others said it was genius. To the streets, it was proof of his legend. To the Mafia, it was an insult carved into stone. The Italians had tolerated Matthews as long as he played the role they had written for him. A profitable outsider, a man who brought in money but knew his place. By refusing tribute, he shredded the script. He was no longer a junior partner. He was a rival, and rivals had to be dealt with. The Mafia operated on respect the way banks operate on interest. Without it, their power dissolved. So Matthews's defiance was not just a financial loss. It was a challenge to their very identity. If one man could say no and live, then others might follow. The example was more dangerous than the act itself. Yet Matthews did live, at least for a time, and that survival became part of the mystique. Why hadn't the Mafia killed him? Why hadn't they sent a crew to make an example of him? Theories spread like wildfire. Some believe his empire was too vast, his reach too strong, that taking him out would spark a war the Mafia couldn't afford. Others thought he had protectors, allies inside the very families he defied, men who quietly admired his boldness or profited from his rise. Still others whispered that fear played a role, that even the Mafia hesitated to touch a man who seemed untouchable. Whatever the reason, Matthews remained. And with each day he remained, his legend grew. He carried himself with calm, never rattled, never flinching. Those close to him recalled how he treated Mafia demands with the same ease he treated law enforcement surveillance. A nuisance, not a threat. It was as if he believed that by refusing to acknowledge their power, he could strip it away. But power doesn't vanish so easily. Behind closed doors, Mafia leaders debated. Some wanted him gone, erased, a message carved into blood. Others saw his empire as too valuable to destroy, a stream of money too large to dam. For once, indecision reigned where usually there was clarity. Matthews had forced even the most ruthless men in America to hesitate. The streets noticed. Hustlers who once feared the Mafia began to dream bigger, emboldened by Matthews's defiance. If Black Caesar could stand tall, maybe they could too. His refusal became more than a personal choice. It became a symbol, a line drawn across the underworld, dividing those who followed tradition and those who dared to break it. For Matthews, the refusal wasn't just stubbornness. It was strategy. Every dollar he didn't hand over was a dollar reinvested into his empire, a dollar that bought loyalty, protection, expansion. Tribute was a tax, and he had no interest in paying taxes. Yet the gamble was enormous. The Mafia had buried men for far less. Each time Matthews walked the streets, each time he sat in a car, each time he leaned back in a restaurant booth, the possibility lingered that it could be his last. Friends noticed the quiet tension, the way eyes flicked to doors, the way conversations carried an edge. Survival was never guaranteed. Still, he thrived. His empire continued to grow, his wealth multiplied, his reputation hardened into myth. The Mafia could not, or would not, strike him down. And so, his legend became a mirror reflecting their hesitation. But hesitation breeds resentment. The longer Matthews lived, the more the Mafia's pride suffered. They could tolerate a rival, but not an equal. And Frank Matthews had become more than equal. In some places, he was stronger. Federal agents watched the tension with fascination. They saw in Matthews's defiance not only a criminal empire, but a crack in the Mafia's facade. If he could survive without paying tribute, perhaps others would follow. Perhaps the Cosa Nostra was not as invincible as it claimed. For law enforcement, it was both opportunity and frustration. Opportunity, because Matthews's independence weakened the Mafia. Frustration, because it also made him harder to control. The old methods, pressuring Italian families to clamp down on their associates, no longer worked. Matthews had cut himself free from their leash, and now he roamed on his own terms. The clash with the Mafia was more than a personal feud. It was a turning point in the history of organized crime. For decades, the underworld had been an Italian-dominated hierarchy. Matthews shattered that image. He proved that a black man could build an empire, could rival the Mafia, could stare into the eyes of the most feared men in America, and refuse to blink. And that proof terrified people. It terrified rivals who saw their own empires suddenly vulnerable. It terrified law enforcement, who realized the old maps of power no longer applied. And it terrified the Mafia, because once respect is lost, it is almost impossible to regain. Matthews never celebrated his defiance publicly. He didn't boast. He didn't taunt. He simply continued, as if the Mafia's demands had never mattered, as if his path had always been clear. That calmness made it all the more unsettling. Defiance shouted can be dismissed as bravado. Defiance whispered, lived out day by day, is far harder to ignore. But the question lingered, hanging in the air like smoke from a gun that hadn't been fired. How long could it last? How long before the Mafia's patience broke? Before whispers turned into bullets? Before defiance demanded the ultimate price? Frank Matthews believed he could outlast them, that his empire, his discipline, His reach made him untouchable. And for a time, he was right. But history shows us that no king rules forever. And Black Caesar had declared himself king in a land where kings were rarely allowed to live. The clash with the Mafia had begun. The respect was real. The fear was real. The defiance was real. And the danger was only just beginning. Chapter 11. The Money Machine. The money never stopped moving. It came in stacks, bundled tight with rubber bands, carried in brown paper bags, hidden in duffel bags, so heavy they needed 2 men to lift. By the early 1970s, Frank Matthews was earning between $10 and $20 million a year. And yet, for all that staggering wealth, he remained a paradox, living large enough to taste luxury, but quiet enough to keep the spotlight at bay. Imagine an apartment filled wall to wall with cash, the smell of ink and paper so strong it clung to the air like perfume. Counting it was not a task, it was an ordeal. Crews sat for hours, their hands moving through piles of bills, their eyes red from fatigue, their voices low as if speaking too loudly might make the money vanish. Numbers that most Americans couldn't dream of were reduced to nightly rituals, tallied and bundled before being whisked away to stash houses, safe deposit boxes, or investments hidden in plain sight. The scale of it defied comprehension. $10 million in a year was more than professional athletes earned, more than CEOs of major companies. And Matthews was pulling it in from the shadows, untaxed, unregulated, untouchable. His business had become a machine, pumping money faster than even he could fully control. Yet he never let the machine control him. Unlike the flamboyant criminals who came after him, men who craved cameras and headlines, Matthews carried his wealth with restraint. He owned mansions, yes, homes with sprawling lawns and driveways lined with expensive cars. He entertained women, showered them with gifts, surrounded himself with the trappings of power. But he didn't strut through nightclubs flaunting gold chains or throwing bills in the air. His wealth was deliberate, calculated, a reflection of control rather than chaos. In that way, he stood in stark contrast to the men whose names would later dominate true crime lore. Escobar built zoos and invited reporters. Gotti strutted in designer suits, smiling for photographers. Matthews was different. His power wasn't measured by spectacle. It was measured by silence. Still, the silence was loud enough for those who knew. Neighbors in upscale suburbs whispered about the quiet man who always paid in cash, who drove cars most had only seen in magazines, who seemed to glide through life untouched by the struggles that weighed on everyone else. Associates spoke of lavish parties, of women drawn to him like moths to flame, of dinners where wine flowed freely and laughter echoed deep into the night. The money bought him more than comfort. It bought protection. Police officers turned blind eyes when envelopes slid across tables. Judges saw defense attorneys backed by fees that smaller dealers could never afford. Friends stayed loyal, not only out of respect, but because betrayal meant giving up access to wealth that felt limitless. Yet wealth carried a burden. The more money that flowed in, the harder it became to hide. Federal agents didn't need informants to know Matthews was rich. They only had to look at the houses, the cars, the businesses suddenly thriving under his watch. Every purchase became another piece of evidence, another clue to the scale of his empire. But Matthews had a gift for slipping between appearances. He could live like royalty on Saturday night and disappear into anonymity on Monday morning. He didn't leave a trail of headlines or a gallery of photographs. For a man handling millions, he left remarkably few fingerprints. That duality fascinated investigators. Here was a man whose empire rivaled the Mafia's, whose money rivaled corporations, yet whose image remained blurred, shadowy, almost invisible. To the public, his name was barely known. To the underworld, it was legendary. The money machine was relentless. Every new city added another stream of income. Every connection tightened the flow. From Brooklyn to Philadelphia, from Newark to Baltimore, from Washington, D.C. to Atlanta, the tide of cash rose higher and higher. Associates later recalled the sheer weight of it. The bags were heavy, the stacks endless, the counting unending. Sometimes, They joked about running out of places to put it. Sometimes, they feared the very volume of cash would expose them, piles too large to ignore. But Matthews always seemed calm. Money, to him, was not just wealth. It was proof. Proof that he had beaten the odds. Proof that he had outmaneuvered the Mafia. Proof that he had turned ambition into empire. And yet, beneath the surface, cracks formed. The more money he made, the more he attracted attention. Attention from rivals who envied his success. Attention from law enforcement desperate to bring him down. Attention from the Mafia whose pride still burned at his defiance. Each dollar was both shield and target, protection and vulnerability. Matthews knew it. He lived with the tension daily. He enjoyed his wealth, but he guarded it fiercely. He spent, but he saved. He flaunted just enough to maintain respect, but never so much that he became a caricature. In that balance lay his survival. The money machine also fed his myth. Young hustlers on street corners told stories of Black Caesar's wealth, stories that grew more exaggerated with each telling. Some swore he had vaults filled with cash. Others believed he owned entire neighborhoods, that his reach extended into every pocket of the city. The truth was already extraordinary, but the myth elevated him into legend. And legends are hard to kill, but even legends carry weight. By the early 1970s, Matthews was no longer just a man running an empire. He was a man balancing on the edge of collapse. The money that protected him also threatened him. The wealth that made him powerful also made him a target. Federal investigators began to tighten the net. Surveillance expanded. Files thickened. Numbers were tallied, connections mapped. They knew the scale, they knew the wealth, and they knew that eventually, even the most careful man could not outrun his own money. Still, Matthews moved with the same calm that had carried him from Durham to the throne of Black Caesar. He didn't panic. He didn't flinch. He treated the millions flowing through his hands not as a curse, but as destiny. For a while, it worked. His machine kept running. His empire kept expanding. His wealth kept multiplying. But money is loud. Louder than bullets. Louder than whispers. Louder than silence. And soon, its noise would bring the walls crashing in. The money machine had made Frank Matthews untouchable. The money machine was about to make him hunted. Chapter 12. Violence in the Trade. The gunfire was sudden, sharp, and final. A body fell to the pavement, blood spreading across the concrete under the dim glow of a street lamp. No speeches, no warnings, just silence after the echoes faded. In the world Frank Matthews built, this was how disputes were settled. This was how lessons were taught. Violence was the punctuation at the end of every sentence, a reminder that power was not maintained by words alone. Matthews had built his empire on discipline, organization, and vision. But in the underworld, discipline without force was weakness. Respect without fear was fragile. To hold an empire together across more than a dozen states, he needed more than money. He needed enforcement. He needed the kind of shadowed violence that kept men loyal, kept rivals at bay, and kept whispers from turning into betrayal. The murders were not random. They were messages. A dealer who skimmed too much from the top, gone. A rival who stepped on a territory that wasn't his, erased. A courier who thought he could play both sides, silenced. Each act of violence carried a weight beyond the blood spilled. It reminded everyone watching that Matthews was not to be tested. Yet Frank was never reckless with violence. He didn't spray bullets in crowded bars or ignite wars just to make a point. His brand of enforcement was calculated, almost surgical. Violence was a tool, not a spectacle. Where some men used it to inflate their egos, Matthews used it to maintain order. The fear it created was quiet but lasting. Men who worked for him didn't need constant threats to stay loyal. They had seen enough, heard enough, to know what would happen if they crossed him. It was like an invisible fence, unseen, but felt by everyone who lived within its reach. Still, violence carried consequences. Every body dropped drew attention. Police chalked outlines on sidewalks. Reporters filled newspapers with stories of gangland murders. Mothers wept in doorways. And though Matthews rarely appeared in those headlines, Investigators knew who sat at the top of the pyramid. They understood that these killings were not random street crimes. They were symptoms of an empire, symptoms of a machine that kept moving forward no matter the cost. Inside his organization, fear and respect walked hand in hand. His lieutenants knew the rewards of loyalty, money, status, protection. But they also knew the price of betrayal. That duality created a culture where obedience was second nature, where hesitation was rare, where ambition was checked by the memory of what had happened to those who reached too far. There were stories whispered in corners, stories of men who vanished after crossing him, stories of meetings that ended with silence and closed doors. No one could prove them, but no one needed to. In the underworld, rumor itself is a weapon, and Matthews wielded it with precision. And yet, behind the ruthlessness, there was calculation. He didn't kill for pleasure, didn't intimidate for sport. He enforced when enforcement was necessary, and he stopped when it wasn't. That discipline kept his organization stable, even as others collapsed under the weight of chaos. But make no mistake, violence defined the trade. Heroin and cocaine were not sold with contracts or signatures. They were sold with territory, with muscle, with the ever-present threat of force. Matthews knew that better than anyone. He may have dreamed of empires and business models, but he operated in a world where blood was currency, and he paid the price when needed. The violence extended beyond his own men. Rivals saw it up close. Those who tried to move against him often met swift and brutal ends. Some thought Matthews's refusal to pay tribute to the Mafia left him vulnerable. But when their soldiers stepped too close, they discovered that his organization was not weak. It was disciplined, armed, and willing to defend itself with deadly precision. The message spread quickly. Frank Matthews was not a man you cross lightly. Still, violence was never clean. Every act created ripples. Families destroyed. Friends seeking revenge. Police gathering files, piecing together patterns, searching for the hand behind the trigger. Matthews walked a tightrope, balancing the need to maintain control with the risk of drawing too much heat. He managed it for years. He kept his violence measured, his enforcement quiet enough to avoid outright war, but sharp enough to keep his empire intact. It was a balance that required constant attention, constant calculation. One misstep, one act too loud or too messy, could bring the entire machine crashing down. And beneath it all was the human cost. Men who pulled triggers for him lived with the weight of it. Some grew numb, their faces blank, their eyes empty. Others cracked under the pressure, their nerves fraying, their loyalty questioned. Matthews understood that too. He knew that even the strongest enforcers were still men, still vulnerable, still capable of mistakes, which meant he had to keep them close, keep them paid, keep them loyal, or replace them when they faltered. The empire thrived on that balance of fear and reward. Dealers on the street feared skimming, but they also knew that steady work under Matthews meant money they couldn't make anywhere else. Lieutenants feared disobedience, but they also enjoyed lives of comfort and power unimaginable to men who started where they did. The violence was a shadow always present, but the rewards kept them walking under it. Frank Matthews himself carried the weight with calm. He didn't speak often about the violence, didn't brag, didn't dwell. To him, it was part of the cost of business, as necessary as shipments, as inevitable as cash. He accepted it with the same discipline that defined his rise. But acceptance didn't erase the danger. Every killing risked escalation. Every act of enforcement risked retaliation. The Mafia watched, law enforcement investigated, rivals plotted. Violence, once unleashed, could not always be contained. And Matthews knew that better than most. Still, he moved forward. His empire demanded it. The heroin flowed, the cocaine spread, the money multiplied. And behind it all was the quiet, steady hum of violence, the unseen engine that kept the machine from falling apart. It was not chaos. It was not spectacle. It was order, enforced with blood. And as long as it worked, Black Caesar remained untouchable. But violence has a way of catching up. The more bodies that fell, the more attention his empire attracted. The more fear he instilled, the more enemies he created. The more control he maintained, the more fragile that control became. Because in the underworld, fear is powerful, but it is also temporary. And soon, Frank Matthews would discover that even the sharpest blade cannot cut forever without dulling. The violence had kept him strong, but it was also leading him closer to the edge. Chapter 13, Law Enforcement Wakes Up. The sound of a reel-to-reel tape recorder filled the small office. Static, muffled voices, then a name repeated in a whisper. Frank Matthews. For years, he had lived in the shadows, his empire growing block by block, city by city. But now, his name was echoing through the halls of federal buildings, scribbled into files, typed into reports, circled in red ink. The silence that had protected him was gone. Law enforcement had finally woken up. By the early 1970s, the scale of Matthews's empire could no longer be ignored. Too many bodies tied to his trade. Too many millions flooding the streets in heroin and cocaine. Too many whispers about a man who seemed untouchable. The FBI wanted him. The newly formed DEA wanted him. The NYPD wanted him. Each agency had its own reasons, but together, they shared one mission: to bring down Black Caesar. For Matthews, the attention was both a sign of success and a looming danger. To be noticed at that level meant he had climbed higher than anyone believed possible. But to be noticed meant the clock was ticking. The government had endless patience, endless resources, and endless determination. They could afford to wait. He could not. Investigations began quietly. Surveillance teams parked outside houses, taking notes on comings and goings. Agents listening on phones, searching for the crack in the armor. Informants were flipped, men caught on minor charges who suddenly found themselves whispering in exchange for leniency. Each detail, each scrap of information, was added to thickening files. The picture they painted was staggering. Matthews was not just a dealer. He was not just a kingpin. He was a man controlling an operation that stretched across more than a dozen states, feeding a drug epidemic that was consuming America. For law enforcement, he became the ultimate prize. Taking him down would mean more than numbers on a report. It would mean proving that no man, no matter how powerful, was beyond the law. The DEA, still young at the time, made him a priority. The agency had been created to combat the very trade that Matthews had mastered. He became one of their top targets, his name whispered in the same breath as the Mafia bosses who had dominated headlines for years. But unlike the Mafia, Matthews was harder to pin down. He left fewer traces, fewer photos, fewer handshakes in public. He was a ghost who lived like a king. The NYPD threw its weight in too. Detectives and narcotics units tracked his crews, mapped his movements, raided stash houses when they could. Each time, they found evidence of the scale, cash, drugs, weapons, but rarely enough to tie it directly back to him. He was insulated, careful, always one step removed. They knew he was at the top, but proving it was another matter. The FBI saw in him something even larger. Matthews wasn't just a drug trafficker. He was a man challenging the established order of organized crime. His refusal to pay tribute to the Mafia, his defiance of Cosa Nostra control, made him both a target and a symbol. To the FBI, taking him down would mean striking at two enemies at once: the drug epidemic and the Mafia's crumbling dominance. But hunting Matthews was like chasing smoke. He moved quietly, rarely repeating patterns, rarely leaving a paper trail. He trusted few, spoke less, and kept his circle tight. Agents grew frustrated. Every time they thought they had him cornered, he slipped away, as if he could sense their moves before they made them. For the men chasing him, the pressure mounted. Each day brought new overdoses, new arrests, new evidence of the empire Matthews controlled. Politicians demanded results. Headlines screamed about the heroin crisis. And in the background, Frank Matthews grew richer, stronger, more legendary. Law enforcement tried to humanize him in their reports, to break him down into habits and routines. But what they found was unsettling. He wasn't reckless. He wasn't loud. He wasn't careless. He was disciplined, organized, thoughtful. That discipline made him harder to catch than the flamboyant criminals who eventually tripped over their own egos. The contrast was maddening. Men like Gotti craved attention and gave investigators endless material to work with. Matthews craved control and left them almost nothing. His money insulated him. His reach protected him. His silence frustrated them. Still, they pushed forward. They tapped phones, hoping for a slip. They followed couriers, hoping for a trail. They flipped lieutenants, hoping for betrayal. And slowly, piece by piece, they began to assemble the outline of his empire. Not the whole picture, not yet, but enough to know they were dealing with something bigger than anyone had admitted. For Matthews, the heat was palpable. He could feel it in the way cars lingered too long behind him, in the way conversations fell heavier, in the way his men grew more cautious. He knew they were watching. He knew they were closing in, but he didn't run. Not yet. He believed his discipline, his structure, his reach could hold them off. Inside federal buildings, his name became a rallying cry. Agents spoke of him with a mix of frustration and respect. They wanted him as badly as they had wanted the Mafia bosses of old. But they also knew he was different. He represented a new kind of power, one that didn't play by the old rules, one that couldn't be easily mapped or predicted. The clash was inevitable. The government would not stop. Matthews would not bow. And somewhere between the two, the storm gathered. By the early 1970s, Frank Matthews was no longer just a criminal. He was a priority. One of the top drug traffickers in the nation, his file thick with intelligence, his name marked for takedown. The question was no longer if they would come for him. It was when. And when they did, would he stand and fight? Or would he do what no one expected? Vanish before they could ever lay their hands on him? Chapter 14. Surveillance and Informants. The click of a phone receiver was the sound of trust collapsing. A voice spoke on the line, unaware that on the other end of a hidden channel, federal agents leaned in closer, headphones pressed to their ears, pencils poised above notepads. Every word mattered. Every pause mattered. And in those words, they hoped, lay the key to bringing down Frank Matthews. By the early 1970s, the hunt for Black Caesar had grown desperate. His empire stretched across more than a dozen states. His money flowed in waves too large to count, and his refusal to bend to the Mafia made him both a target and a legend. To stop him, law enforcement needed more than raids and arrests. They needed intelligence. They needed eyes inside his world. And so, the wiretaps began. Agents worked the phones with patience bordering on obsession. Every call Matthews's men made, about product, about shipments, about money, was another thread. They followed coded language, piecing together fragments like archaeologists dusting off broken pottery. A simple phrase about packages could mean kilos. A casual mention of friends visiting could mean a shipment arriving from overseas. To outsiders, it was ordinary talk. To trained ears, it was evidence. But the problem was always the same. Matthews himself. He rarely spoke directly. He avoided phones when he could, preferring face-to-face meetings, knowing the walls had ears. His discipline frustrated agents. They caught lieutenants, runners, street-level dealers on tape, but rarely the man at the top. It was like fishing with a net full of holes. The smaller catches slipped through, but the big one kept swimming free. So they turned to another weapon: informants. In the underworld, loyalty was everything, until survival demanded otherwise. Men caught on minor charges suddenly found themselves facing years behind bars. Some had families they couldn't abandon, others had habits they couldn't feed in prison. And when agents offered deals, shorter sentences, cash, protection, the cracks in loyalty widened. Informants were both lifeline and poison. They offered law enforcement details no wiretap could capture: who met where, who handled what, how money and drugs moved. But they were also unreliable, often telling agents what they thought they wanted to hear, exaggerating truths to stay useful, sometimes fabricating stories to protect themselves. Sorting truth from lies became a constant battle. Still, bit by bit, the picture sharpened. Reports described Matthews's network in greater detail. Meetings in apartments guarded like fortresses. Couriers carrying thousands in cash. Shipments disguised as ordinary cargo. And above it all, the calm figure of Matthews, rarely seen, rarely heard, yet always present. Undercover operations followed. Agents posed as buyers, as middlemen, as hustlers looking for a way in. They worked their way toward the edges of his empire, shaking hands with men who swore loyalty to Matthews, but couldn't resist a deal that looked profitable. Some operations succeeded, capturing evidence of the scale of the trade. Others collapsed, the agents exposed, their covers blown. Each attempt carried risk. Each failure made Matthews more cautious. For the men chasing him, the work was exhausting. Hours spent listening to static-filled tapes. Nights spent parked in cars outside dimly lit apartments. Days spent flipping through pages of surveillance reports. They lived in the shadows of his empire, always searching, always waiting, always falling just short. And for Matthews, the pressure was unmistakable. He felt it in the way eyes lingered too long, in the way conversations had to be guarded, in the way men around him sometimes grew nervous. He knew informants existed. He knew phones were tapped. He knew agents sat in cars with binoculars aimed at his world. And yet, he continued. Calm, steady, unshaken. His discipline became his armor, his silence his shield. But silence was never perfect. Every empire has cracks. Every network has weak links. And as the investigations deepened, those cracks widened. Informants gave up stash houses. Wiretaps revealed patterns of movement. Undercover agents secured meetings that exposed the flow of money. Each piece alone was small, but together they formed a mosaic. The mosaic showed a man who had built something staggering, a man who had defied the Mafia, rivaled the most powerful criminals in America, and made millions beyond imagination. A man who now stood at the center of law enforcement's crosshairs. Still, they couldn't touch him. Not yet. The evidence, though mounting, remained elusive. Enough to prove the empire existed, but not enough to tie it directly to Matthews. He hovered like a ghost, just beyond their grasp. His presence felt, but never pinned. The frustration boiled. Agents raged quietly in offices, slamming down tapes, swearing at reports that led nowhere. They knew he was there. They knew he was guilty. But knowing and proving were two different battles. And Matthews, disciplined as ever, fought his by saying less, moving carefully, trusting only those who had proven themselves 100 times over. For the men inside his world, the tension grew unbearable. Every conversation carried risk. Every call could be tapped. Every meeting could be watched. Some grew paranoid, whispering about bugs in walls, tails on cars, eyes behind curtains. Some broke under the weight, choosing self-preservation over loyalty, turning informant to save their own skin. And with each betrayal, the circle around Matthews tightened. The FBI, DEA, and NYPD grew bolder, convinced they were closing in. Files swelled with names, dates, addresses. Tapes piled higher. Reports thickened. The walls seemed to be closing. But Frank Matthews remained untouchable. He moved with the same calm he always had, slipping past traps, staying one step ahead, refusing to let the weight of surveillance slow him down. For every informant who betrayed him, there were others still loyal. For every wiretap that captured his men, his own voice remained absent. He was the ghost at the center of the storm, visible in shadow, but never caught in the light. And yet, ghosts cannot haunt forever. The surveillance was working. The informants were talking. The evidence was building. The net was tightening. And soon, the law would not just whisper his name in backrooms. They would speak it aloud in courtrooms. Frank Matthews knew it. He could feel it. The question was no longer whether they were watching. The question was how long before they made their move. And when they did, would he still be a ghost? Or would the man called Black Caesar finally be forced into the light? Chapter 15. The 1972 Summit in Atlanta. The hotel ballroom buzzed with attention that could not be disguised. Men in sharp suits sat at round tables, their eyes scanning the room, measuring one another with glances heavy with calculation. They weren't politicians. They weren't businessmen in the traditional sense. They were drug traffickers, the most powerful black dealers in America, summoned to Atlanta in 1972 for a meeting unlike any the underworld had ever seen. At the center of it all was Frank Matthews, Black Caesar, the man who had built an empire that stretched across more than a dozen states, who had defied the Mafia, who now sought something bigger than any one man's operation. He wanted unity. He wanted organization. He wanted to turn scattered hustlers and regional bosses into a coalition capable of rivaling the old powers that had dominated crime in America for decades. The very idea was audacious. In the underworld, unity was rare. Pride, ego, and ambition often kept men apart. Territory was guarded jealously, and trust was always fragile. Yet Matthews believed that if the Mafia could coordinate across cities and families, then black dealers could do the same. The meeting in Atlanta was his boldest move yet, a summit designed to centralize power and prove that his vision was more than just words whispered in backrooms. The atmosphere in that room was electric. Some came out of curiosity, eager to hear what Matthews had to say. Others came with suspicion, unsure if the summit was a trap, a setup, or a stage for Matthews to flaunt his dominance. Federal agents would later claim that dozens of men attended, representing networks from New York, Philadelphia, Baltimore, Chicago, and beyond. Each man carried the weight of his own empire, but each knew that Matthews was the reason they had gathered. When he spoke, the room quieted. He didn't shout. He didn't need to. His presence commanded attention. His words carried the weight of someone who had proven himself in action, not just ambition. He spoke of opportunity, of money flowing like rivers if they worked together, of independence from the Mafia's stranglehold on supply. He painted a vision of an underworld where black traffickers were no longer subordinates, but equals, where their wealth and power could rival anyone's. It was more than business. It was defiance. For years, the Mafia had dictated the terms of the heroin trade, collecting tribute and enforcing obedience. Matthews wanted to break that chain, to cut out the middlemen, to build direct connections to international suppliers. The Atlanta summit was the first step, a declaration that the old rules no longer applied. The men listened. Some nodded, inspired by his vision. Others shifted uneasily, aware of the risks. Unity meant sharing power, and sharing power meant giving up control. In a world where betrayal was as common as loyalty, where bullets often settled disagreements faster than words, trust was hard to sell. Still, the fact that Matthews had gathered them at all was remarkable. The Mafia had never allowed such independence. Law enforcement had never believed such coordination possible. Yet here it was, unfolding in a hotel ballroom in Atlanta, a glimpse of what the future of organized crime could look like. Outside the room, federal agents speculated. They had heard whispers of the meeting, whispers that confirmed Matthews's growing ambition. To them, the summit was proof that he was no longer just a drug trafficker. He was a visionary attempting to reshape the underworld itself, and that made him even more dangerous. For the men inside, the summit ended with no single agreement, no signed contracts. But the message was clear. Matthews was staking his claim as a leader, as a man with a vision that stretched beyond blocks and corners, beyond cities and states. He was building something bigger, something that terrified both his rivals and the law. The risks were obvious. The Mafia would not tolerate such defiance. Law enforcement would not ignore such audacity. Even among his peers, jealousy and suspicion simmered. Yet Matthews carried himself with the same calm he always had, as if the dangers were just background noise, as if his vision was already inevitable. Those who were there never forgot it. They spoke of the confidence in his voice, the steadiness in his tone, the way he seemed to embody both ambition and inevitability. For a brief moment, it seemed possible that a coalition of black traffickers could rise, organized, powerful, independent. But possibility is not certainty. The underworld is a place where visions often die young, choked by ego, greed, betrayal, or bullets. Matthews' summit in Atlanta was bold, unprecedented, even historic, but also painted a target on his back larger than ever before. Because by daring to organize, by daring to dream of unity, Matthews had done more than defy the Mafia. He had dared to challenge the very balance of power in American organized crime. And once that balance is challenged, someone always strikes back. The Atlanta summit proved that Frank Matthews was not content with being a king in his own city. He wanted to be an emperor of many. But emperors, history reminds us, rarely grow old in peace. Chapter 16. Indictments roll in. The knock on the door wasn't unexpected. By 1972, Frank Matthews had lived long enough in the shadows to know that the law was coming. But the weight of the papers delivered, thick, stamped, official, was more than just a formality. It was the sound of the walls finally pressing in. Indictments. Stacks of them. Drug trafficking. Conspiracy. Tax evasion. Each page another link in the chain the government hoped to wrap around Black Caesar's neck. Federal prosecutors have been building the case for years. Wiretaps. Informants. Surveillance reports. Testimony from men who had once sworn loyalty but now whispered into microphones behind closed doors. The picture that emerged was staggering. Matthews wasn't just another trafficker moving weight in Brooklyn. He was the architect of one of the largest drug empires America had ever seen. And that empire, no matter how carefully built, had become too big to hide. The indictments carried the weight of a storm. Each charge was another thunderclap, rolling closer, shaking the foundations of his empire. Drug trafficking alone was enough to put him away for decades. Conspiracy charges added years, stacking penalties like bricks in a wall. Tax evasion, the same weapon that had once brought down Al Capone, was sharpened against Matthews too. The government wanted not only to catch him, but to bury him. For law enforcement, the moment was triumphant. After years of frustration, of chasing whispers and shadows, they finally had paperwork that pointed directly to him. His name inked in black letters, his empire reduced to counts and codes. For agents who had sat in cars through long nights, who had worn wires into dangerous meetings, who had spent hours listening to tapes filled with static, this was proof their work mattered. But indictments are not convictions. And Matthews knew it. The charges were serious, but they were also complicated. Conspiracy, by nature, is built on testimony, on men flipping, on stories told under pressure, on connections drawn by prosecutors eager to stitch a web. Drug trafficking required evidence, tangible proof of weight and movement, and Matthews had always kept himself insulated from the hand-to-hand deals. Tax evasion depended on records, numbers, trails of money, and Matthews had grown rich in cash, rivers of bills that rarely touched banks. He understood the battlefield. He knew the government had declared war, but he also knew that wars are won in the details. And Matthews was a man of details. Still, the weight of the indictments could not be ignored. His lieutenants felt it. They saw the papers, heard the whispers, felt the tension in every conversation. Some grew nervous, wondering if loyalty would hold when faced with decades behind bars. Others stood firm, determined to ride with him until the end. But the uncertainty lingered, heavy as smoke. The prosecutors moved with confidence. They spoke of Matthews as a priority, as a symbol of the drug epidemic ravaging the country. In press conferences, they hinted at the scale of his empire, painting him as a kingpin who thought himself untouchable. Behind closed doors, they worked to tighten the net, to prepare for trial, to build a case so strong that even Matthews' discipline could not escape it. And yet, even in the face of indictments, he remained calm. Witnesses later recalled how he carried himself with the same steadiness, the same quiet confidence, as if the charges were just another obstacle, another challenge to outmaneuver. He hired lawyers, the best money could buy, men who understood both the courtroom and the streets. He studied the papers, weighing their strength, calculating his moves. But indictments are more than legal documents. They are pressure. Pressure on allies to betray. Pressure on lieutenants to crack. Pressure on families to beg for cooperation. Pressure on a man to choose between fighting and fleeing. And as the months passed, that pressure only grew. Matthews had always thrived under pressure. The streets of Durham, the dice games of Brooklyn, the rise of his empire, all of it had been built on his ability to stay calm when others panicked. But even he could see that the government was relentless. Unlike rivals who could be intimidated, unlike the Mafia who could be defied, the government never stopped. It didn't scare. It didn't sleep. It didn't forget. The charges stacked like dominoes, each one threatening to topple the empire he had spent years building. For every lawyer he hired, prosecutors added another count. For every loophole he explored, agents searched for another informant. It was a race, one man's discipline against an entire system's determination. And then came the realization. The indictments were not just aimed at Matthews. They were aimed at everyone around him. His lieutenants, his couriers, his associates in Philadelphia, Baltimore, Newark. By spreading the charges wide, the government forced a choice. Stand with him, or save yourself. Some chose loyalty. Others chose survival. The cracks widened. The machine that had once run with clockwork precision began to falter under the weight of subpoenas and grand juries. Meetings grew quieter. Men grew more cautious. Trust became brittle. Matthews, as always, stayed steady. He didn't panic, didn't lash out, didn't crumble. But even he could not ignore the truth. The government had made its move. The game had changed, and the clock was ticking. The indictments marked a new chapter, one where discipline alone might not be enough. The charges were heavy, the evidence mounting, the pressure suffocating. For years, Frank Matthews had lived as a ghost in plain sight, seen, whispered about, but never caught. Now the government had given him a shape, a name, a file. The question was no longer if they would come for him. The question was when. And when they did, would Frank Matthews stand in court to face the storm? Or would he choose a different path? One that would make his story not just legendary, but eternal? Chapter 17. Arrest and Bail. The flash of red and blue lights shattered the night. For years, Frank Matthews had lived as if he were untouchable, a man who slipped past traps, who walked through surveillance nets like smoke through a sieve. But in the summer of 1973, the inevitable finally caught up. The law, patient and relentless, made its move. The king of the streets was in handcuffs. Agents described the arrest with a mix of triumph and relief. They had studied him for years, built case files thicker than phone books, stacked indictments like bricks, and now they finally had their man. Matthews did not fight. He did not plead. He simply stood calm, collected, as if being led away in chains was just another turn in a game he had already planned to win. The news spread fast. Black Caesar, the man whispered about in barbershops and backrooms, the ghost who had haunted the East Coast drug trade, was behind bars. Headlines screamed. Agents smiled for the first time in years. Prosecutors sharpened their speeches. It felt like victory. But victory in the underworld is never simple. The charges were heavy. Conspiracy, trafficking, tax evasion. Enough to put Matthews away for life if prosecutors got their way. But the system, for all its power, is built on rules. And those rules gave Matthews something no agent wanted him to have. Bail. The number was staggering by ordinary standards. Hundreds of thousands of dollars. To most men, it would have been impossible. But Matthews was not most men. For a man whose empire pulled in tens of millions each year, bail was not a punishment. It was pocket change. Within days, the money was arranged. Papers were signed. Conditions set. The government, believing in its own net, allowed the gates to open. Matthews walked free, awaiting trial. It was, in hindsight, one of the greatest mistakes the system ever made. To prosecutors, bail was routine. To Matthews, it was opportunity. Freedom, even temporary, meant time to think, time to plan, time to move pieces across a board only he could see. He knew the weight of the charges. He knew the government's case was strong. He knew that once the trial began, the odds tilted heavily against him. Freedom meant choice. Fight or vanish. On the streets, his arrest carried a different weight. Some whispered that his empire would crumble now, that lieutenants would scatter, that rivals would pounce. Others believed he would fight the charges, confident that his lawyers could twist the government's evidence into dust. But a select few understood something deeper. Frank Matthews was too disciplined, too calculating, to leave his fate in the hands of a jury. He moved quietly in those weeks after bail. He spoke little. He lived in the same calm that had carried him through years of pressure. But beneath the calm was a storm. Plans were being formed. Choices weighed. Money shifted. And the government, so proud of its arrest, had given him the time he needed. Agents still watched, of course. Surveillance continued. Phones were tapped. Cars followed. Meetings monitored. But watching a man is not the same as holding him. Every day he remained free was another day he could maneuver. His lawyers prepared for trial, filing motions, combing through evidence, building defenses. But even they wondered, was Matthews truly preparing to fight, or was he preparing for something else entirely? The truth was simple. Bail is meant to keep a man tethered. But for a man like Frank Matthews, bail was a broken chain. He knew the government wanted to make an example of him. He knew the Mafia still simmered at his defiance. He knew the streets were restless, waiting to see what would happen to Black Caesar. And he knew, above all, that prison was not his destiny. Freedom had given him the one thing he valued most, control. The system believed it had him cornered, but in reality, it had opened the door. And somewhere in the silence of those weeks, Frank Matthews made his choice. The arrest was supposed to be the end. The bail was supposed to be routine. But both were only preludes to the real story, the story that would turn Matthews from kingpin into legend. Because soon, the man who had built an empire, who had defied the Mafia, who had stared down the government itself, would step off the stage, and no one would ever see him again. Chapter 18. The Disappearance. The date was July of 1973. The heat hung heavy in the air, the kind of sweltering summer heat that made city nights feel restless and endless. Somewhere in that haze, Frank Matthews made his move. He was supposed to be preparing for trial, tethered by the conditions of his bail, watched by a system that believed it had finally caged him. Instead, he vanished. Just like that. Gone, with millions in cash and his girlfriend at his side. It didn't happen with gunfire or headlines. There was no dramatic police chase, no shootout in the streets. His disappearance was quiet, almost ordinary in its execution, which only made it more extraordinary. One day he was there. The next he was not. And the man called Black Caesar stepped out of the pages of criminal indictments and into the fog of legend. The details remain a puzzle, even today. Agents pieced together fragments in the weeks that followed. Bags of cash had been withdrawn, moved carefully, hidden from the eyes that were always watching. Associates whispered of plans made in coded conversations, of trips hinted at but never explained. Some said he left with as much as $20 million in cash, stuffed into suitcases, bundled into cars, spread across the hands of men loyal enough to carry it without question. When he left, he didn't go alone. At his side was his girlfriend, the woman who had stayed with him through the rise, through the wealth, through the growing pressure of indictments. Together, they walked away from the world he had built, leaving behind an empire, an indictment, and a city stunned by his absence. The government was blindsided. They had believed in their net, in the weight of their indictments, in the security of bail. They had underestimated him. Matthews had spent his entire life staying one step ahead, outthinking rivals, outmaneuvering the Mafia, outrunning law enforcement. Why should this be any different? He had turned the government's own system against itself, using bail as his escape hatch, buying time to plan, then slipping away when the moment was right. Panic rippled through federal offices. Agents scrambled to track his movements, pulling at every thread, chasing every whisper. Airports were checked, borders monitored, informants pressed for details. But Matthews had vanished too cleanly. No tickets, no passports, no trace. It was as if the man who once commanded one of the largest drug empires in America had dissolved into thin air. Speculation filled the void. Some swore he fled overseas, France, Africa, South America. Others believed he stayed closer to home, hidden in plain sight under a new identity. A few whispered darker theories that the Mafia, unwilling to let his defiance stand, had erased him quietly, his body buried where no one would find it. But there was no body, no proof, only absence. The streets buzzed with disbelief. Hustlers who once looked to him as a king now spoke of him as a ghost. His disappearance became a kind of myth, told and retold, each version more elaborate than the last. Some said he lived in luxury abroad, his millions buying him peace. Others believed he lived in exile, looking over his shoulder every day, haunted by the empire he left behind. And some believed he never left at all, that he slipped into another life just blocks away, hidden by silence and discipline. What made his disappearance so haunting was its finality. Men in his position are not supposed to disappear. They are supposed to be killed, or imprisoned, or dragged into courtrooms to face judgment. Matthews chose none of those paths. He chose his own ending, or perhaps his own beginning, and left the world to wonder. The government's failure was humiliating. They had captured him, indicted him, paraded him as proof of their strength. And then, through their own mistake, they had let him slip away. The bail they granted became a scar on their record, a reminder that even the most powerful system can be outplayed. For Matthews, the decision must have carried weight. To vanish was not just to escape. It was to abandon everything he had built. His empire, his wealth in America, his name on the streets. It all had to be left behind. He had lived as Black Caesar, ruler of an empire, but to survive, he had to become something else entirely. A ghost, nameless, faceless, unknown. Did he regret it? Did he feel pride as he slipped away, or sorrow for what he left behind? No one knows. He never spoke. His silence became his final masterpiece. The disappearance marked the end of an era. Without Matthews, his empire fractured. Rivals moved in, lieutenants scattered. The machine that once moved like clockwork broke into pieces. The Mafia reclaimed ground. Law enforcement claimed victory in the void, though it was hollow. They hadn't captured him. They hadn't tried him. They hadn't sentenced him. He had beaten them in the simplest way possible, by leaving. And so the legend was born. Frank Matthews, the man who rose from Durham to rule the East Coast drug trade, the man who defied the Mafia, the man who built an empire worth tens of millions, simply walked away. No trial, no prison cell, no grave, just absence. The story has lingered for decades. Every rumor of a sighting reignites the mystery. A man in South America with familiar features. A shadow in Europe. A whisper in Africa. Each possibility adds to the myth, but none provide answers. The only certainty is uncertainty. In the summer of 1973, Frank Matthews disappeared. And in disappearing, he became more than a kingpin. He became a riddle, a ghost, a legend whispered in the dark. Where he went, only he knew. And perhaps that was the point all along. Chapter 19. The hunt begins. The phone lines lit up before dawn. Federal marshals, DEA agents, FBI investigators, men who had spent years chasing Frank Matthews, were told the unthinkable. Their prize, the kingpin they had finally caged, was gone. He had slipped bail, vanished into the heat of the summer of 1973. In that moment, panic became policy. The manhunt began. Across the country, bulletins went out. His name, his face, his charges were spread through law enforcement channels like wildfire. The message was clear: capture him at all costs. Matthews was no longer just a trafficker, no longer just a fugitive. He was an embarrassment, a man who had made fools of the very agencies that prided themselves on never losing. The marshals took the lead. Fugitive hunting was their craft, their reputation built on the claim that no one could hide forever. They knocked on doors in Brooklyn, questioned neighbors, pressed his former associates. But the trail was already cold. Matthews had planned too carefully. He hadn't vanished in panic. He had vanished in precision. The DEA spread its net wider. Airports were checked, passports flagged, flights scrutinized. Agents combed through customs records, searching for any hint that he had left the country. They questioned contacts in the Dominican Republic, in Cuba, in France, places where Matthews had once built connections. But no one could, or would, confirm a thing. The FBI, with its international reach, sent cables overseas. They spoke to Interpol, reached out to allies in Europe and South America. Matthews was painted as one of the top fugitives in America, a man whose capture was as much about restoring pride as it was about justice. Yet overseas, too, the silence remained. No fingerprints, no photographs, no sightings. For law enforcement, the frustration grew by the hour. How could a man so large, so wealthy, so notorious, simply disappear? They scoured the homes he had owned, the apartments he had rented, the hotels where he was known to stay. Each search came up empty. It was as if he had erased himself from the map. The money made it worse. Unlike most fugitives, Matthews didn't vanish broke. He vanished rich. With millions in cash, he could buy silence, buy protection, buy new lives in new places. Cash, unlike checks or transfers, leaves no trail. It moves in shadows, hand to hand, untraceable. Every agent involved in the manhunt knew this, and it haunted them. They weren't chasing a desperate man. They were chasing a ghost with bottomless pockets. Leads trickled in, as they always do. A sighting in Miami. A whisper in the Dominican Republic. A rumor in Africa. Each one sent agents running, chasing shadows across continents, only to find dead ends. The marshals compared it to chasing smoke. You could see it, smell it, sense it, but never grasp it. Inside their offices, maps were pinned with markers, notes scrawled in the margins, timelines stretched across walls. Each line ended with a question mark. The frustration boiled. Men who had spent their careers hunting fugitives admitted that Matthews was different. He wasn't just hiding. He had vanished with an elegance that defied explanation. And while the law searched, the legend grew. On the streets, his name became myth. Hustlers whispered that he was living in South America, sipping rum under palm trees with his millions stacked in villas. Others swore he had returned to Africa, embraced by distant relatives, protected by distance and heritage. A few even joked that he never left New York at all, that he walked among them in disguise, laughing at the men who chased him. Every rumor fed the myth. Every failure deepened the humiliation. The government had dedicated men, money, and time to catching him. And yet, every report came back the same. No trace found. For his family, the disappearance carried a different weight. Loved ones questioned what had happened, torn between worry and silence. Some believed he had been killed, erased by enemies who had waited for the perfect moment. Others clung to the hope that he was alive, building a new life somewhere far from the reach of the law. But no phone calls came. No letters arrived. His silence was complete. The marshals grew more desperate. They released wanted posters, spread his photograph, pushed his story into the press. They reminded the public that he was dangerous, that he was a criminal who had profited from addiction and destruction. But even with publicity, even with his face plastered across papers, no reliable leads surfaced. The DEA turned inward, examining whether someone inside had tipped him off, whether corruption had greased his escape. But no proof ever surfaced. If Matthews had help, it left no fingerprints. If he had planned his escape, he had left no blueprint. The FBI considered the possibility that he had been killed. But without a body, without evidence, it was only speculation. And speculation was not enough. The manhunt stretched from days into weeks, from weeks into months. Each passing moment widened the gap between Matthews and his hunters. Fugitives are easiest to catch in the first hours, when panic leaves trails, when mistakes are made. Matthews made none. His discipline, the same discipline that had built his empire, had built his escape. And so the search grew colder. For law enforcement, the disappearance became a scar, a reminder that even the most powerful system in the world could be outplayed. For the streets, it became a story told in whispers, a tale of defiance that turned a kingpin into a ghost. For Matthews, wherever he went, it was the beginning of a life untethered to the past, a life built on silence and shadow. The hunt never truly ended. His name remained on fugitive lists, his file thick in government drawers. Agents retired with his face still etched into their memories. Younger men took up the case, each convinced they would be the one to solve it. But none ever did. In July of 1973, Frank Matthews vanished. The manhunt that followed stretched across borders and oceans, across years and decades. And yet, no trace was ever found. The law had begun the hunt with confidence, with certainty, with pride. But as days turned into decades, only one truth remained. Frank Matthews had beaten them all, and somewhere, perhaps, he was still laughing. Chapter 20, Theories of Escape. The night Frank Matthews vanished, the world was left with more questions than answers. No body, no confirmed sighting, no slip of paperwork at a border crossing. Nothing but silence. And in that silence, theories were born. Theories that would grow into legends, whispered in street corners, debated in police stations, repeated by journalists and hustlers alike. Where did Black Caesar go? One of the earliest rumors spoke of Africa. It was said Matthews felt a pull to the continent, a place where he might vanish into a crowd of faces that looked like his own, where his money could buy comfort and protection, and where American law enforcement had little reach in those days. Some swore he had family roots there, distant ties that would welcome him home. To them, it wasn't just escape, it was return. A king retreating to an ancestral throne no one else could touch. Others painted a different picture. South America. In the 70s, the continent was already a haven for fugitives, revolutionaries, and criminals with money to spend. Countries like Colombia, Brazil, and Venezuela had thriving black markets, governments with porous borders, and officials willing to look the other way if the price was right. For a man with millions in untraceable cash, South America would have been paradise. A place where he could disappear into bustling cities or remote countryside, shielded by bribery and distance. Then there was the Caribbean theory. Islands close enough to America to feel familiar, yet far enough to avoid scrutiny. Dominican connections, Cuban traffickers, Jamaican networks, all had ties to Matthews during his rise. Some believed he simply stepped into those worlds, protected by men who owed him favors, embraced by islands where loyalty was bought and silence was survival. The Caribbean, with its endless coastlines and fluid movement of money and people, could have swallowed him whole. But not every theory imagined him alive. Some whispered darker tales, that the Mafia, humiliated by his defiance, had finally exacted its revenge. That Matthews never left at all, that he was silenced, buried in unmarked ground, his millions seized by those who had waited patiently for their moment. This theory carried weight. Matthews had not only refused to pay tribute, he had embarrassed men who built their lives on fear and respect. For some, his disappearance was too convenient, too clean, to be voluntary. Death, they argued, was the only explanation. Law enforcement entertained all these theories. Agents mapped possible escape routes, ran names through foreign contacts, sent cables overseas. Some swore they had credible leads in Africa. Others pointed to rumors of him living quietly in South America, a ghost with a villa and a new name. None of it ever solidified. Every lead melted under scrutiny. Every rumor collapsed when pushed. The most haunting theory, though, was the simplest. That Matthews had stayed in America, hidden in plain sight. The idea that he could shave his beard, cut his hair, change his name, and blend into the millions of faces walking city streets. With millions in cash, he could live quietly, buying what he needed, staying invisible, never drawing attention. It wasn't as romantic as fleeing overseas, but it was possible. And possibility, in the absence of evidence, is enough to fuel a legend. Those who had known him disagreed on what he would choose. Some insisted he had too much pride, too much ambition, to vanish into obscurity, that he would seek a place where he could live like the king he had always believed himself to be. Others argue the opposite, that Matthews was too disciplined, too cautious to risk visibility, that his survival instinct would push him toward anonymity, toward a life lived in silence rather than a throne abroad. And then there was the question of money. If he carried 20 million in cash, how long could it last? Some believed he lived richly, enjoying every dollar, buying protection and luxury in a foreign land. Others believed he rationed it, living modestly, stretching the fortune to last decades. Still others doubted the figure entirely, suggesting he had taken less than rumored, that the legend of 20 million was itself an exaggeration born of whispers. For the men who hunted him, the theories were maddening. Each possibility felt plausible. Each one collapsed under lack of proof. And each collapse only deepened the mystery. On the streets, the theories became folklore. Hustlers told stories of seeing him in Havana, sipping rum by the ocean. Others claimed he was spotted in Lagos, walking through markets with guards at his side. A few swore he had been seen in Brooklyn itself, older, quieter, but unmistakable. Each story contradicted the other, yet each added to the myth. Matthews was everywhere, which meant he was nowhere. The Mafia theory lingered longest. To those who believed in the iron fist of Cosa Nostra, Matthews's defiance could not go unanswered. His disappearance, they said, was no escape but an execution, a warning disguised as a mystery. But the lack of a body, the lack of whispers in Mafia circles, made others doubt. If the mob had killed him, wouldn't they want the world to know? Wouldn't they want his fate to serve as a message? Silence, in this case, didn't quite fit. The Caribbean theory gained traction over the years. Matthews's ties to Dominican and Cuban suppliers were real. The islands had always been havens for smugglers, traffickers, fugitives. For a man with cash and connections, slipping into that world would have been natural. Yet, again, no proof. No photographs. No confirmations. Just whispers. And the African theory carried a weight of romance. The idea of Matthews returning to ancestral soil, living as a king in exile, embraced by distance and heritage. It fit the myth of Black Caesar perfectly, a man who rose from the streets of Durham, ruled the East Coast, defied the Mafia, and then claimed a throne across an ocean. It was poetic. But was it true? No one knew. What made the mystery so powerful was not just the lack of answers. It was the discipline of Matthews himself. He had lived his entire life by staying one step ahead, by refusing to leave trails, by keeping his circle small. His disappearance was simply the final act of that discipline. He had mastered the art of silence, and silence became his ultimate escape. For the government, the theories were salt in the wound. Every rumor of a sighting mocked their failure. Every whispered possibility reminded them that they had lost him. The marshals chased leads for years, each time returning empty-handed. The DEA kept his file open, hoping for a break. The FBI continued to circulate his name, long after most of his contemporaries were dead or imprisoned. Yet the trail never warmed, and so the mystery remained. Did Frank Matthews flee to Africa, living out his days in wealth and obscurity? Did he hide in South America, protected by cartels and bought officials? Did he settle in the Caribbean, shielded by old allies and endless coasts? Did he remain in America, a ghost living quietly under a new name? Or did the Mafia silence him before he could ever leave, burying the secret with his body? Each theory holds weight. Each one could be true. Each one could be false. And perhaps that was Matthews's genius. By disappearing completely, he ensured that every possibility would live. Every theory would breathe. Every whisper would add to his legend. Frank Matthews didn't just escape. He created a riddle. And decades later, the world is still trying to solve it. Chapter 21. Family and Associates Left Behind. When Frank Matthews vanished in the summer of 1973, he didn't just erase himself. He erased the foundation of an empire, leaving behind family, lieutenants, and rivals to deal with the wreckage. For them, his disappearance was not freedom, it was fallout. And the shock waves rippled for years. The first to feel it were his closest associates. The men who had once looked to him for leadership, protection, and profit suddenly found themselves exposed. The boss was gone, the machine was broken, and the law was circling like sharks. Indictments had not disappeared with Matthews. Federal prosecutors still had thick files, still had evidence, still had names. And without their leader, many of those names turned into targets. Some of Matthews's lieutenants were arrested within months. They faced the same charges he had escaped: conspiracy, trafficking, tax evasion. But unlike Matthews, they had no escape plan, no millions in cash, no legend to shield them. They stood in courtrooms alone, forced to fight battles that had once been fought under his shadow. Sentences came down heavy. Years in prison became the cost of loyalty or the punishment for proximity. Others tried to step into the vacuum. They thought they could claim pieces of the empire Matthews had left behind: territories in Brooklyn, pipelines into Philadelphia, contacts in the Caribbean. But stepping into his shoes was like walking into fire. Rivals pounced. The Mafia reclaimed what it believed was theirs. Law enforcement swarmed. Without Matthews's discipline holding it all together, the empire fractured into chaos. And then there were those who vanished too. Associates who had known too much, carried too many secrets, or feared retaliation from enemies who believed Matthews's disappearance had left debts unpaid. Some slipped quietly into new lives. Others disappeared without explanation, swallowed by the same darkness that had taken their boss. For Matthews's family, the pain was different. They were left with questions, whispers, and the constant gaze of law enforcement. Agents knocked on doors, pressed for information, convinced that family ties would lead them to the fugitive. But if anyone knew, they never spoke. Silence became their inheritance, secrecy their burden. Some family members carried the weight of suspicion for decades. Wherever they went, the shadow of Frank Matthews followed. Employers, neighbors, even strangers whisper behind their backs, asking if they knew, if they had seen, if they had helped. Living under that shadow was a punishment of its own. For rivals, his disappearance was a mix of relief and opportunity. The Mafia, long insulted by his refusal to pay tribute, no longer had to face the defiance of Black Caesar. They moved quickly, reclaiming ground, reasserting dominance in territories Matthews had once carved out. Smaller dealers who had been pushed aside by his rise tried to claw back relevance. But no one filled the void completely. The scale of his empire had been too vast, his discipline too rare. Without him, the map of the drug trade shifted, but it never returned to what it had been. Among his closest men, the disappearance created fractures of loyalty and resentment. Some admired him even more for escaping, seeing his vanishing act as the ultimate move of genius. Others felt abandoned, left to face prison while he walked free with millions. Quiet bitterness grew, though rarely spoken aloud. Speaking ill of Matthews was dangerous even after he was gone. His legend demanded respect, and respect in the underworld is often enforced by silence. The human cost was brutal. Wives and children left behind struggled to make sense of it all. Some were forced to visit loved ones in prison, others to bury them after rivalries turned violent. The children of Matthews's associates grew up with fathers missing, either locked away or gone forever. His disappearance didn't just shatter his empire. It shattered families. The government, too, bore scars. Matthews's vanishing act humiliated federal agencies. Agents who had spent years chasing him were left to explain to the public how their star target had slipped through their hands. Some careers stalled. Some men never stopped chasing, clinging to the hope of redemption. The sting of that failure never faded. Meanwhile, the myth of Black Caesar grew stronger precisely because of those he left behind. Each associate arrested, each rival silenced, each family broken only added to the aura of his absence. The more damage his disappearance caused, the more powerful his legend became. But myths do not erase pain. For those closest to him, the silence was unbearable. Did he think of them when he left? Did he feel guilt as he carried his millions into the unknown? Or did discipline harden into coldness, cutting ties as cleanly as severing a rope? Some believed he intended to send for them, to bring family and loyal men into whatever new life he had built. But no call ever came. No message ever arrived. If Matthews planned to return for them, The plan died in silence. In the end, those left behind carried two legacies. One was the crushing weight of his absence, the trials, the prison terms, the suspicion, the whispers. The other was the shadow of his legend. To be connected to Frank Matthews was to be connected to a man who had beaten the system, a ghost who had written his own ending. For some, that shadow was a curse. For others, strangely, it was pride. Yet all of them, family, lieutenants, rivals, were left with the same haunting uncertainty. They had been part of his story. They had lived in his orbit. And then, in the summer of 1973, he was gone. Gone with millions. Gone with his girlfriend. Gone into legend. And those left behind were left with the wreckage. They carried the weight. They carried the silence. And in that silence, the ghost of Black Caesar only grew larger. Chapter 22, Law Enforcement's Embarrassment. The headlines were merciless. The most wanted drug trafficker in America, a man federal agents had spent years building a case against, had walked free on bail and vanished. No shots fired, no dramatic chase, just gone. For the FBI, the DEA, and the U.S. Marshals, it was humiliation broadcast across every newsroom in the country. Frank Matthews had not only defied the Mafia and built an empire, he had embarrassed the government itself. Inside federal offices, the mood was raw. Agents who had celebrated his arrest only months earlier now sat in silence, shuffling papers that suddenly felt useless. All those indictments, all those hours of surveillance, all those informants, they had built a case meant to cage him forever. And yet, the system had given him a door and watched him step through it. Matthews hadn't just escaped. He had exposed weakness. Reports poured in from every agency involved. The DEA circulated internal memos analyzing how such a high-level target could have been granted bail in the first place. The FBI drafted assessments highlighting jurisdictional confusion, the cracks in cooperation between local police, federal prosecutors, and national agencies. The marshals, charged with hunting fugitives, defended their work while privately admitting the trail had gone cold almost immediately. No one wanted to take responsibility. Prosecutors pointed at judges. Judges pointed at bail guidelines. Agents pointed at each other. The truth was simple. The law had underestimated Frank Matthews. They believed money would keep him tethered. Instead, money had fueled his escape. Press conferences were tense. Officials promised the public that Matthews would be found, that no fugitive could outrun the reach of the United States government. Behind closed doors, however, confidence was thinner. Agents admitted to reporters off the record that Matthews was unlike other fugitives. He hadn't run broke. He hadn't run scared. He had run with millions in cash and a plan. That combination made him nearly impossible to chase. Every year that passed without an arrest deepened the shame. Cases like this were supposed to end in headlines of triumph. Kingpin sentenced, justice served, order restored. Instead, the Matthews file gathered dust, becoming a reminder of failure. In interviews years later, retired agents would still bristle at the mention of his name, their voices tinged with bitterness. Some called it the one that got away. Others called it the greatest embarrassment of their careers. The government tried to downplay the failure. Official statements stressed that Matthews was dangerous, but that time was on their side. They suggested he couldn't hide forever, that money would eventually run out, that fugitives always made mistakes. But those reassurances rang hollow as months turned into years, and years turned into decades. Matthews had not been caught. Matthews had not been seen. Matthews had not even been heard from. The silence mocked them. Investigations were launched internally. How had bail been set so low? Why had surveillance been so lax? Who had failed to predict that Matthews, facing decades behind bars, might simply walk away? Committees drafted recommendations. Guidelines were rewritten. But none of it changed the fact that the damage was already done. The man at the center of one of the biggest drug cases in U.S. history was gone. Worse still, his disappearance made the agencies look divided. The FBI, DEA, and marshals had all claimed pieces of the case, but coordination had been fractured. Each wanted the glory of catching Matthews. Each wanted the credit for the takedown. And in the competition, the cracks widened. Matthews had slipped right through them. The embarrassment was not just his escape. It was the proof that the very agencies tasked with protecting the country could not work together against one man. The public reaction stung. Newspapers mocked the system. Editorials questioned how justice could be so careless. Community leaders in New York, Philadelphia, and Baltimore asked why the government had celebrated his arrest so loudly if they couldn't hold him afterward. Even within law enforcement, rival agencies quietly ridiculed each other. The DEA whispered that the marshals had failed. The marshals whispered that prosecutors had bungled bail. The FBI whispered that everyone but them had dropped the ball. It was a storm of blame with no end. And in the middle of it all, Frank Matthews's legend grew. Every day he remained free, he made the system look weaker. Every rumor of his survival, every whispered sighting, was a reminder that the government's net had holes. The embarrassment wasn't just internal. It was public, humiliating, undeniable. For the men on the ground, the agents who had tapped phones, tailed cars, risked their lives in undercover work, the sting was personal. They had invested years in the Matthews case, only to see it collapse not from lack of effort, but from systemic failure. They spoke of it bitterly over drinks, some admitting that the ghost of Matthews haunted them long after they left the job. One retired agent confessed that every time he saw a man of Matthews's build on a crowded street, he wondered if it was him. The higher-ups try to move on. New cases, new targets, new kingpins fill the headlines. But Matthews's file never closed. It remained on desks, in cabinets, updated every few years with new notations of dead ends. His name sat on fugitive lists long after his contemporaries were dead or forgotten. Each new director or chief inherited the embarrassment, another reminder of the system's failure. What made it worse was the simplicity of it. Matthews had not escaped from a maximum security prison. He had not broken free in a daring heist. He had been granted bail and walked away. That detail made the government look less like a hunter bested and more like a fool outplayed. In the underworld, that distinction mattered. It gave others hope, whispered proof that even the most powerful system could be beaten with the right mix of money and discipline. The embarrassment lingered for decades, feeding conspiracy theories and fueling distrust in law enforcement. Did someone inside help him? Was corruption part of his escape? Had he bribed officials to look the other way? No proof ever surfaced, but the questions themselves deepened the wound. For every unanswered question, Matthews's legend grew stronger and the government's reputation weaker. And so, the story of Frank Matthews became not just a story of empire and escape, but a story of humiliation. The man who built an empire in defiance of the Mafia had also defied the might of the United States government. His disappearance wasn't just an ending. It was a mirror, reflecting the cracks in the system that was supposed to be unbreakable. Agents aged. Files gathered dust. The world changed. But the embarrassment never faded. The government had been beaten, not in a courtroom or a back alley, but in its own house. Frank Matthews had taken their rules, turned them inside out, and disappeared through the gap. And to this day, no one has closed it. Chapter 23: Legacy in the Drug World. The streets have long memories. Long after Frank Matthews vanished in the summer of 1973, his name still carried weight. Hustlers who came of age in the late 70s and 80s whispered about him like a ghost story, half warning, half inspiration. He was the man who had built an empire in defiance of the Mafia, who had stacked millions in cash, and who had slipped away without leaving a trace. For the next generation of black drug kingpins, Matthews was more than a fugitive. He was a blueprint. By the time Nicky Barnes rose to prominence in Harlem, Matthews had already disappeared. But Barnes's ambition carried echoes of Black Caesar. Like Matthews, he understood the power of organization. He brought together crews under a centralized structure, modeled after corporations and syndicates. The idea that black dealers didn't need to bow to outsiders, that they could carve out empires of their own, had already been proven by Matthews. Barnes simply put on display dressing it in sharp suits, and daring to flaunt his success where Matthews had remained cautious. Frank Lucas, too, operated in a shadow cast by Matthews. Lucas famously bypassed middlemen by going directly to suppliers in Southeast Asia, smuggling heroin back hidden in coffins of dead soldiers. But the spirit of cutting out the Mafia, of refusing to pay tribute, of seizing independence, those were seeds Matthews had planted years earlier. Lucas may have grabbed headlines, but the quiet defiance of Matthews had laid the foundation. Then came Freeway Ricky Ross in the 80s, who built a cocaine empire stretching across Los Angeles and beyond. Ross spoke often of how he learned from the men who came before him, studying their mistakes and their victories. For him, Matthews was part of the mythos, proof that black traffickers could rise not just locally but nationally, commanding networks that rivaled any syndicate in the country. Ross ran cocaine with efficiency that mirrored Matthews's heroin empire, disciplined and structured, with cash flowing in torrents. But Matthews's influence wasn't just about structure or discipline. It was about myth. His disappearance elevated him beyond ordinary criminals. Barnes, Lucas, and Ross all faced the same fate eventually: prison. Matthews had dodged it. He had written an ending no one else managed, an ending that left him untouchable. For younger men chasing power, that ending was intoxicating. It suggested that the system could be beaten, that with enough money and foresight, you could vanish into freedom rather than rot behind bars. Yet there was a cautionary edge to his story, too. The men who followed often lacked Matthews's restraint. Barnes craved publicity, appearing in magazines, crowned Mr. Untouchable, until his arrogance drew the full wrath of the law. Lucas indulged in spectacle, telling tales that blurred truth and fiction, leaving him vulnerable when prosecutors pieced together his empire. Ross grew vast but was caught, his freedom stripped away in a courtroom. Matthews, in contrast, had never flaunted his wealth so publicly. He had never courted cameras. He had built in silence and escaped in silence. That contrast haunted the men who came after. On the streets, his name was a kind of legend passed like scripture. Younger hustlers admired him not just for his wealth, but for his vision. He hadn't settled for neighborhood control. He had dreamed of national networks, of summits uniting black traffickers across cities, of independence from the Mafia's grip. That vision made him more than a dealer. It made him a pioneer. Law enforcement recognized his influence too. Internal reports noted that Matthews's model of organization was echoed in later cases. His ability to scale operations, to spread across multiple states, had shown what was possible when discipline met ambition. The agencies that had once failed to hold him studied his methods to anticipate the next Matthews, the next empire waiting to rise. And still, his legend lingered. Decades later, in documentaries, books, and conversations among ex-dealers, his name resurfaced. He was spoken of in the same breath as Escobar and Gotti, not because his empire was the largest, but because his ending was the cleanest. Escobar died on a rooftop in Medellin, gunned down by authorities. Gotti died in a prison hospital, his arrogance undone by tapes and betrayal. Matthews disappeared. That disappearance gave him something no other kingpin possessed: mystery. And mystery is the strongest currency in the underworld. It fuels stories, inspires imitators, and ensures immortality. For Nicky Barnes, Matthews's example was both guide and ghost. Barnes sought independence, but couldn't resist attention. He became a symbol of Harlem's opulence, but when he fell hard, serving decades before his release. For Frank Lucas, Matthews's influence was in the boldness of bypassing traditional channels. Lucas proved it could be done, but his story ended in indictments, prison, and later, contradictions that blurred his true impact. For Ricky Ross, Matthews's lesson was discipline, structure, and ambition. Yet Ross's empire, too, collapsed under the relentless weight of federal charges. Matthews's myth became the contrast, the road not taken by those who remained visible. His story whispered a dangerous lesson. If you want to win, disappear before the law closes in. Few could do it. He had. But his legacy wasn't only in inspiration. It was also in fear. Law enforcement grew sharper because of him. They pushed for stricter bail guidelines, tougher surveillance, closer coordination between agencies. They studied the Matthews case like a manual of failure, determined never to let another Black Caesar slip through their fingers. In a strange way, his disappearance shaped both sides of the war, the dealers who sought to emulate him, and the agents who sought to prevent another like him. Even now, his name sparks debate. Was he the greatest to ever do it? Or just the luckiest? Was his discipline the reason for his success? Or was his disappearance a fluke that history has exaggerated into genius? The answers don't matter as much as the fact that his story refuses to die. That refusal is legacy. In the end, Frank Matthews' place in history is not just as a fugitive, or a trafficker, or a man who vanished with millions. His place is as a pioneer, a man who showed that Black kingpins could rise to heights once reserved for others, a man who defied the Mafia and lived to tell it, if only in silence, a man who, by vanishing, carved out immortality. The streets never forgot him. The underworld studied him. The law still carries the bruise of his escape. And every hustler who dreamed bigger than a block, bigger than a corner, bigger than a city, dreamed in the shadow of Frank Matthews. And yet, as his legend passed into myth, one truth remained. Every empire ends. The question was whether Matthews's empire ended in triumph, or whether it ended the moment he stepped into silence. Chapter 24. Pop Culture and Myth. The image is almost cinematic. A man with millions in cash, slipping into the shadows, leaving behind a city buzzing with rumors and a government humiliated. No trial, no sentence, no grave, just absence. In that absence, Frank Matthews transformed from a fugitive into something larger. He became a myth. And myths, once born, don't die easily. By the late 1970s, the streets were already retelling his story in tones of awe. Hustlers spoke of him not like a criminal, but like a folk hero. The Black Caesar who had stood against the Mafia, outsmarted the feds, and disappeared with his fortune intact. Every retelling grew bigger, bolder, blurred by time and imagination. One man said he fled with 10 million. Another swore it was 20. Some even claimed he had billions stashed away, the kind of money that could buy countries. The numbers didn't matter. What mattered was the idea that he had beaten both the mob and the government and lived free. Books followed, each layering myth onto memory. Writers fascinated by his story pieced together his rise and fall, his power and disappearance. They spoke of him as one of the greatest to ever play the game, the man who had rewritten rules and slipped out before the final page was written. Documentaries echoed the fascination, narrating his story with shadows and whispers, filling gaps with speculation, keeping his ghost alive for new generations. Each time his name appeared on a screen or in print, it added another brushstroke to the portrait of Black Caesar. Urban legends filled the spaces between fact and fiction. In barbershops, men claimed their cousin's friend had seen him in Miami, living quiet under another name. In clubs, hustlers swore he was spotted in South America, driving expensive cars, untouched by law. Older men nodded knowingly, claiming Matthews had made it to Africa, embraced like a king, living in wealth and obscurity. The stories had no proof, but they didn't need it. Legends thrive on possibility. What gave his myth such power was the contrast. Every other kingpin of his era had an ending written in stone. Nicky Barnes, betrayed and imprisoned. Frank Lucas, exposed, arrested, and later reduced to contradiction. Escobar, gunned down on a Medellin rooftop. Gotti, rotting in a prison hospital. But Matthews had no ending. He existed in a permanent state of uncertainty, an open loop that invited endless retellings. His silence was louder than their headlines. Pop culture embraced that silence. He became a symbol in music. His name dropped in verses as shorthand for power, wealth, and defiance. Rappers spoke of him with reverence, placing him alongside larger-than-life figures who bent the world to their will. In those lyrics, Matthews was not a cautionary tale, but an aspiration, a man who had walked away free, leaving the system behind. Even Hollywood flirted with his myth. Characters in films carried echoes of him. The disciplined kingpin who stayed in the shadows, who avoided the spotlight, who built quietly and struck decisively. Screenwriters borrowed from his story without naming him, weaving pieces of Black Caesar into composite characters who embodied the dream of outsmarting both law and rival. But the myth was not only about defiance. It was also about mystery. People are drawn to what they cannot explain. Matthews became a riddle that refused to be solved. Was he alive or dead? Did he live as a king in exile or as a ghost in hiding? Theories kept his story alive because every theory was plausible. Every version felt possible. And possibility is the fuel of myth. For the communities he had once ruled, his legend carried pride. He was a black man who had stood equal to the Mafia, who had built wealth beyond imagination, who had made white prosecutors and federal agents look powerless. His story was told as proof that the underdog could rise, that the game could be won. It was survival reimagined as triumph. Yet, beneath the glamour, there is always a shadow. Families destroyed by heroin, streets scarred by violence, associates left in prison or in graves. Matthews's empire had fed destruction as much as it had fed his pockets. But myth has a way of sanding off the rough edges, of highlighting triumph while dimming tragedy. The man who had left chaos behind was remembered less for the pain and more for the escape. That, too, is the nature of legends. They tell the story we want, not always the one that was. Law enforcement, for their part, tried to keep the myth in check. Reports described him as ruthless, dangerous, a trafficker who had profited from misery. Officials emphasized the destruction his drugs had caused, the lives lost in addiction, the violence that followed his empire. But their words rang hollow against the allure of the mystery. The system had failed to catch him, and failure gave his story more weight than their warnings ever could. Decades later, when journalists revisited his case, they found the myth stronger than ever. Younger generations who hadn't even been alive when Matthews vanished spoke of him, as if he were a figure out of folklore. The details didn't matter. What mattered was the idea. The Black Caesar who had won. And that idea seeped into culture in ways subtle and overt. His story became a symbol of resistance, of outsmarting a system designed to crush. For hustlers, he was proof the game could be played on their terms. For writers and filmmakers, he was a character too compelling to ignore. For law enforcement, he was the ghost who never let them forget their failure. The myth of Frank Matthews endures because it is unfinished. Stories with endings fade. Stories with question marks last forever. Matthews left his story open-ended, and in doing so, he ensured that every generation would retell it, reshape it, and keep it alive. But legends, no matter how powerful, always leave one question behind. Did the man who became a myth ever live to see the weight of it? Or did he vanish so completely that even his own legend became something he could never touch? Chapter 25. The Man Who Got Away. The final chapter of Frank Matthews' story is not written in ink. It is written in shadows, in questions that have no answers, in whispers that stretch across decades. The summer of 1973 was the last time anyone could say for certain where he was. After that, the trail vanishes, and all that remains is the haunting reality. Frank Matthews is the man who got away. Most great criminals of the 20th century ended in cages or coffins. Al Capone, once untouchable, withered in prison, his empire crumbling to dust. John Gotti, the so-called Teflon Don, died shackled by illness behind bars. Pablo Escobar, who once ruled Colombia like a king, was cut down on a Medellin rooftop, his blood staining the tiles for the world to see. Their endings were brutal, definitive, carved into history. But not Matthews. He didn't fall in a hail of bullets. He didn't rot in a cell. He didn't waste away from disease. He stepped off the stage entirely, leaving the world to stare at an empty spotlight. That absence, that silence, became his final victory. Was he killed? It is possible. Some believe the Mafia, long humiliated by his refusal to pay tribute, finally struck back when the moment was right. That his disappearance was not freedom, but execution, his body buried in the quiet earth, his millions stolen, his myth an illusion. But if that were true, where is the proof? Why no whispers from mobsters who relish taking credit for every act of vengeance? Why no body, no rumor solid enough to hold weight? The silence feels too complete for murder. Did he escape abroad? Theories abound. Africa, South America, the Caribbean, places where money spoke louder than law, where a man could buy silence and safety with cash stacked high. In those places, it isn't hard to imagine Matthews building a second life. A villa by the ocean, guards at the gate, a quiet existence funded by the fortune he carried into the wind. Maybe he lived as a king in exile. Maybe he blended into crowds, an anonymous man with extraordinary wealth. But if so, why not a single confirmed sighting? Why not one mistake, one photograph, one slip of the tongue in 50 years? Or did he stay here, in America, hiding in plain sight? It would be the boldest move of all, to shave the mustache, cut the hair, change the name, and walk freely among the millions. To shop at corner stores, to drive unnoticed, to live modestly while the world searched for a kingpin. Cash makes invisibility possible, and Matthews had plenty of it. Some insist they saw him, older, quieter, living small lives in small towns. But speculation is not proof. The truth may be one of these theories, or maybe none of them. The truth may never be known. That is the power of Frank Matthews' story. It doesn't end. It lingers. What cannot be denied is the mark he left. Matthews was a pioneer. Before Barnes, before Lucas, before Ross, he showed what was possible. He built an empire that stretched across more than a dozen states, rivaled the Mafia, and stacked tens of millions in cash. He was a businessman in the underworld, disciplined, calculated, refusing to be reckless or loud. And then, at the height of his power, he walked away. For law enforcement, his disappearance is an open wound. His name stayed on fugitive lists for decades. Agents retired still haunted by the case they couldn't close. His file remains in drawers, thick with reports, each page a reminder of failure. The United States government, with all its reach, could not catch him. That humiliation has never faded. For the streets, his disappearance is legend. The myth of Black Caesar became more than fact. It became folklore. He was the one who beat them all, the mob, the feds, the system itself. His story was retold not just as crime, but as triumph. A man who lived on his own terms and refused to let anyone else write his ending. And for his family, his associates, those left behind, the disappearance was not triumph, but tragedy. They paid the price for his absence: imprisonment, violence, suspicion, silence. For them, Matthews' legend was not freedom. It was abandonment. They carried the weight of his choices, even as he lived, or died, elsewhere. The mystery endures because it is unfinished. Every other name, Capone, Gotti, Escobar, has an ending carved into stone. Matthews remains an open question. That open question makes him immortal. Even now, half a century later, his face stares from old wanted posters. His name lingers in documentaries and songs. His ghost drifts through the stories of hustlers who dream too big. Frank Matthews is no longer just a man. He's an idea. The idea that you can beat the system. The idea that you can disappear. The idea that freedom, if you are disciplined enough, bold enough, ruthless enough, is possible. But legends are dangerous. They inspire as much as they warn. Matthews' empire left scars: addiction, violence, families torn apart. His disappearance may have been victory for him, but for those he left behind, it was ruin. The myth hides that truth, and maybe that is why myths endure. They tell the story we want, not always the story that was. So, was Frank Matthews killed, his body buried in silence? Or is he alive, somewhere in the world, an old man watching his legend grow? No one knows, and perhaps no one ever will. That uncertainty is his final act. His silence is his masterpiece. Because unlike Capone, unlike Gotti, unlike Escobar, Frank Matthews remains the one who got away. And maybe, just maybe, he's still out there,